They say you can read a person by their hands. Derek Vaughn's hands were calloused, blackened with grease, and that day they were signing a $2,500 check, the last bit of money in his account, to buy 10 piles of scrap metal that the whole hall was laughing at. Standing right behind him, Sienna Ashcroft, billionaire, queen of the American luxury car industry, laughed loudly enough for the whole world to hear. Little did she know she had just made the most expensive mistake of her life. If you're reading this story, please like and comment your city name below, so I know how far my story has come. And don't go anywhere, because what happens in the next 30 days will change everything. The morning started the way most of Derek Vaughn's mornings did. Badly. His alarm went off at 5:14 a.m. Not because he set it for 5:14, but because the cheap digital clock on his nightstand had been running 6 minutes fast since the battery died, and came back wrong 3 months ago, and he'd never gotten around to fixing it. He lay there for exactly 4 seconds staring at the water stain on the ceiling above his bed, the one shaped vaguely like the state of Texas, and then he swung his legs over the side and put his feet on the cold floor. The house was quiet except for the furnace, which made a sound like a dog trying to cough up something it swallowed. He pattered down the hallway in his socks and cracked open the door to his son's room. Caleb was 7 years old and slept with the covers pulled all the way over his head, just a mop of dark hair visible against the pillow. Derek watched him breathe for a moment. That was the whole point of everything. That chest rising and falling, that kid sleeping safe. He pulled the door almost shut and went to make coffee. The kitchen of their rented house in Harlan County, Kentucky, was small enough that you could touch both walls if you stretched your arms out sideways, which Derek had actually done once to prove a point to nobody. The linoleum floor had a crack running from the refrigerator to the base of the sink, and the window above the counter looked out onto a gravel driveway, and beyond that, the entrance to his garage, a converted 2-bay structure he leased separately from a retired farmer named Earl Compton, who kept threatening to raise the rent and never did. Derek drank his coffee standing up, the way he always did. He was 32 years old. He had a mechanics certification from a community college, 12 years of hands-on experience, a 7-year-old son, and a savings account with a number in it that would have made most people physically ill. He'd been building that number, slowly, painfully, $20 here, $50 there, for 2 years, ever since his wife Sandra had decided she'd rather be somewhere warmer and less complicated and had left Caleb with Derek and left Harlan County for good. The last he'd heard, she was in Phoenix. She called on Caleb's birthday. Sometimes. The money in the account, $2,500 and change, was supposed to be the down payment on a diagnostic machine that would let him compete with the chain shops that had opened up along Route 119. Without it, he was still relying on tools that were older than his son and a reputation built entirely on word of mouth. But 3 days ago, he'd heard about the Callaway County salvage auction. He'd almost talked himself out of going 6 different times. But the auction grounds were off a county road 40 miles west of Harlan on a flat piece of land that smelled like cut grass and old oil. By the time Derek arrived with his flatbed trailer hitched to his pickup, the parking lot was already crowded. Mostly dealers and pickers, guys in logoed shirts talking on cell phones, a few museum representatives who stood slightly apart from everyone else with their lanyards and their clipboards. Derek got out of his truck and walked the lot first, the way he always did. The vehicles up for auction were arranged in 3 rough rows. Most of them were exactly what they looked like: tired, beaten, salt-corroded junk. Station wagons with crumpled quarter panels, sedans with interiors that had hosted several generations of rodents, a pickup truck with no engine and a bed full of someone's old National Geographic collection. But Derek moved slowly. He didn't look the way the other guys looked, scanning surfaces, checking for obvious salvage value, calculating scrap weight. He crouched down. He looked at welds, he looked at the way one piece of metal met another, he looked at casting marks and stampings and manufacturing details that most people walk right past because they don't know what they mean and they're in a hurry. He was at the 7th vehicle, a 1969 muscle car that had been painted over so many times you could barely identify what color it had started out as. When he felt it, he wouldn't have been able to explain it to someone who didn't do what he did for a living. It was the way a particular shadow fell wrong inside the engine compartment when he propped the hood, the way certain fasteners had been replaced with hardware that was better than factory. Little things. Things that didn't match the history the car wore on its surface. He spent 40 minutes on that car. Then he spent time on 3 others in the same row. He was still crouching beside the last one, a battered late 60s coupe with its driver's window missing, when he heard the voice. "I wouldn't bother if I were you." He looked up. She was standing about 10 feet away with 2 men who had the look of professional associates. Not quite assistants, not quite bodyguards, but somewhere in that general neighborhood. She was somewhere around 30, dressed in clothes that were expensive enough that they didn't look expensive, if you knew what you were looking for. Dark hair pulled back, sunglasses pushed up on her forehead. The kind of ease that comes either from being born with money or from spending enough time with it that your body forgets what it felt like not to have it. He'd seen her face before. Not in person. In a magazine his waiting room had been carrying for the last 6 months because nobody had gotten around to swapping it out. Sienna Ashcroft. Her family company had built luxury sedans in Detroit for 3 generations, and she'd taken it over at 26 when her father had his first heart attack. There was a whole profile on her with a full-page photograph. She looked more or less the same in person, except the photograph hadn't captured the particular way she looked at things she considered below her attention. She was looking at Derek that way now. "Excuse me?" he said. "This lot." She gestured at the row of cars with a small motion that managed to be simultaneously dismissive and polite. "Our team assessed it yesterday. There's nothing here worth salvage. Whoever put these on the block was hoping someone didn't know any better." She smiled, not unkindly. "Just trying to save you some time." Derek stood up. He was taller than she'd probably expected, or maybe she just hadn't expected him to stand up straight. He wiped his hands on the shop rag he kept in his back pocket. "I appreciate it," he said. "Sure." She turned to go. "Can I ask who did the assessment?" She turned back with the expression of someone who hadn't expected a follow-up. "My chief technical evaluator. He's been in the industry for—" "The coupe at the end of the row," Derek said. "Did he check the firewall on the passenger side, the lower section, below the main harness cluster?" A small pause. "He does a full evaluation." "Okay," Derek said. She studied him for a second. "You think there's something there?" "I think your guy did a good job," Derek said. "I think he did it fast." Something shifted behind her eyes. Not quite irritation, not quite respect, but something that contained elements of both. Then one of her associates said something quietly, and she nodded and moved on down the row, and Derek went back to what he was doing. Chut. The auction started at 11. There were maybe 60 people in the main tent, seated on folding chairs that had been set up in a rough semicircle around a low platform where the auctioneer, a heavy-set man in a bolo tie named Dale, who had done this particular auction for 11 years running, stood with his microphone and his list. Most of the lots moved fast. Farm equipment, some estate furniture. A collection of vintage road signs that 2 collectors got into a brief war over before one of them gave up at $1,800. The vehicles were lots 22 through 38. Most of them went cheap, scrap prices, to dealers who would strip them down and sell the metal. A couple of the less destroyed ones got a little competition before settling. There was brief excitement over a mid-70s truck that turned out to have an original factory radio, which went to a collector from Lexington for $3,400. Then Dale announced that lots 31 through 36 would be bundled. "We're going to move these 6 together as one lot," he said, shuffling his papers, seeing as how individual interest has been limited. 6 vehicles, take 'em or leave 'em. Who wants to start us at 500? Derek watched. Nobody moved. 400? Nothing. "Come on, folks, we need to move these. $400 gets you 6 vehicles. Scrap alone covers it." From the other side of the tent, Sienna Ashcroft had her arms crossed. She wasn't bidding. Her team had already acquired the 2 lots they'd come for. Derek raised his hand. $350. Dale pointed at him. $350. Do I hear 4? Nobody heard 4. $350 going once. $400, said a voice near the back. A dealer named Tuck Barnett, who Derek recognized, a large man who moved slow and talked slower and had made a comfortable living off other people's underestimation of him for 25 years. $450, Derek said. Tuck looked at him. Derek didn't look back. $500, Tuck said. $650, Derek said. A murmur in the tent. People were paying attention now because there was no logical reason for a guy in a worn work jacket to be fighting for 6 vehicles nobody wanted. 700, Tuck said, and now his voice had a question underneath it. 900, Derek said. Tuck was quiet for a moment. Then he shook his head once, slowly, and that was that. Sold, Dale said, $900. Then lots 37 and 38 came up. The last 2 vehicles, another bundle. The 1969 muscle car and the coupe Derek had spent the most time on. 1,200, Derek said, before Dale finished his opening sentence. The tent went quiet, the way tents do when something unexpected happens. 1,200, Dale repeated. Do I hear 13? Nobody heard 13. Sold. Sir, you have won lots 31 through 38. That is 8 vehicles for a total of, Dale did the math, $2,100. Derek nodded. What he didn't have was the other 2 vehicles from the row, lots 28 and 29, which had been sold separately earlier in the auction to 2 different buyers. He'd been watching. Lot 28 had gone to a private collector for $280. Lot 29, a rusted shell with no obvious value, had gone to a scrapper for $190. He approached both buyers after the auction closed. The collector, a retired teacher named Morris, who picked up old cars as a hobby and stored them in his barn, took $240 to flip the title on Lot 28. He'd paid $280, and he knew he'd overpaid, and he was happy to recover most of it. The scrapper looked at Derek like he was making a joke. It's worthless, son. I was going to charge the landowner to take it. I'll give you 160, Derek said. I paid 190. You paid too much for worthless, Derek said pleasantly. 160 is my number. The scrapper thought about it for 11 seconds, Derek counted, and then said, Fine, but you haul it. Total spent, $2,500 even. He'd cleared out his savings account to the last dollar. Set. It was while he was hitching the first vehicle to load onto his flatbed that the real trouble started. He heard the laughter before he understood what it was aimed at. He'd been vaguely aware that a small crowd had gathered near the auction tent's exit, the kind of idle clustering that happens when an event winds down and people are in no hurry to leave. But he hadn't been paying attention to it because he was trying to figure out the logistics of getting 10 vehicles loaded onto one flatbed trailer with a come-along and a ratchet strap system that had seen better days. Seriously, somebody go ask him. A man's voice, younger, with the edge of someone performing for an audience. I'll do it. Another voice, female, bright with amusement. Derek straightened up and turned around. There were maybe 15 people watching him, not a hostile crowd. Worse than that. A curious crowd, the kind that gathers around a car accident, not because they want to see anyone hurt, but because something outside the normal pattern of the day has presented itself. Standing at the center of the loose group, her sunglasses back on her face now, was Sienna Ashcroft. She hadn't instigated it. He could see that, but she hadn't stepped away from it either. "Excuse me," said a young woman at the front of the group, mid-20s, holding a phone that was very clearly already recording. "Can I ask what you're planning to do with all these?" Derek looked at her. He looked at the phone. "Restore them," he said. "All 10?" "All 10. A few people exchanged glances. The young woman with the phone turned to include the rest of the group in what was apparently now a shared amusement. "And you know these are... everyone here said there's nothing worth..." "I know what everyone said," Derek said. The young woman turned to Sienna instinctively, the way people turn to the most prominent person in a group when they want their reaction validated. And Sienna, who was smart enough to know better, who would spend months afterward trying to understand exactly why she'd done it. Sienna laughed. Not a small private laugh. The real thing. Genuine, unguarded, and loud enough to carry. "The man who spent his last dollar on 10 piles of rust," she said. "Someone make sure to tell his kid what Daddy did with the college fund." The crowd rippled with laughter. Not all of them. Some people looked at their feet, suddenly uncomfortable. But enough. Derek turned back to his trailer. He didn't say anything. He didn't look at her. He picked up his come-along and started winching the first car onto the flatbed, and the crowd drifted and the laughter faded, and eventually even Sienna moved on to where her car was waiting, and the comment went with her. Or so she thought. But the young woman with the phone had gotten all of it. Chug. By 9 o'clock that evening, the video had 400,000 views. Derek didn't know that yet. He was at his garage figuring out where to store 10 vehicles in a 2-bay space. He'd pulled in every favor Earl Compton had left in the bank and negotiated temporary use of a dry storage barn 2 properties over. He was moving cars in the dark with a flashlight in his teeth and a checklist in his head. His phone had been buzzing for 3 hours with notifications he didn't understand until Caleb's babysitter, a 19-year-old named Yvonne who lived next door, came over at 9:30 to drop off his son and showed him what was happening. "You're on the internet," Yvonne said, with the reverence a 19-year-old reserves for things they consider cosmically significant. The video was 47 seconds long. It showed him crouching by the last car, then standing up, then loading the flatbed. Sienna's voice was perfectly clear. The man who spent his last dollar on 10 piles of rust. "Someone make sure to tell his kid what Daddy did with the college fund." The comments were what you'd expect. People who didn't know him assuming everything. People who didn't know anything about old cars assuming everything else. The one thing everyone agreed on was that he was an idiot. "Does this kind of thing go away?" Derek asked. Yvonne looked at him with the gentle pity of someone explaining a difficult concept to a much older generation. "No," she said. "Not really." He handed her phone back. "Thanks for watching him." "Derek, I've got a lot to do tonight," he said. After she left, he stood in the doorway of the barn and looked at the 10 vehicles he'd lined up in 2 rows. In the overhead light of a single work bulb hanging from a rafter, they looked exactly like what everyone had said they were. Broken, forgotten, not worth the floor space they were taking up. Caleb appeared at his elbow, pajama-clad, holding the stuffed rabbit he'd slept with since he was 2. "Yvonne showed me," Caleb said. "The lady on the phone." Derek looked down at him. "She was mean," Caleb said with the straightforward clarity of 7-year-old moral reasoning. "Yeah. Are you sad?" Derek thought about it, actually considered the question. "No," he said. "I'm behind schedule. That's different." Caleb seemed to accept this. He looked at the cars for a moment with the serious expression he used when he was processing something. "Are they good cars?" "I think so." "How do you know if nobody else knew?" Derek crouched down so he was at eye level with his son. In the barn light, Caleb's eyes were very dark and very awake for 10 o'clock at night. "You know how you can tell when someone's having a bad day?" Derek asked. "Yeah. But sometimes people walk right past someone having a bad day and don't notice?" Caleb nodded. "It's like that," Derek said. "These cars are having a bad day, a very long bad day, but they're still themselves underneath it. You just have to look right." Caleb considered this with the gravity it deserved. "Okay," he said. "Okay." Derek straightened up. "Now go to bed." "Can I come out here tomorrow?" "If you do your homework first." "Deal," Caleb said immediately, and turned and went back to the house with the certainty of a child who has just successfully negotiated the terms of his weekend. Derek started the next morning before the sun was up. He began with documentation. Every car, every visible surface, every component he could access without disassembly. He photographed everything. He had a cheap digital camera that was about 6 years out of date, and he moved through the 10 vehicles with the systematic patience of a man who has learned that what you don't write down you will eventually forget, and what you forget will eventually cost you. The muscle car he saved for last. It was a 1969 Dodge Charger, or had been, once. Whatever it had been before someone had painted it 3 different colors and stripped the interior and replaced the glass with plywood and left it in a field somewhere in western Kentucky for what looked like at least a decade. The body had cancer, as old car people call rust. Not the surface kind that cleans up, but the kind that has eaten through the metal in patches, leaving holes you could put your fingers through in the lower quarter panels and along the rocker seams. Most people would have looked at it and seen scrap. Derek opened the hood. He'd already known something was different. He'd known it the moment he'd looked through the firewall during the preview. He'd told Sienna's evaluator as much, though the man had never come back to check. What he found when he had the hood fully open and a proper light on it stopped him cold for a full 60 seconds. The engine was wrong, not wrong bad, wrong remarkable. It was a V8, which was correct for a 69 Charger, but the block had been machined in ways that the factory never machined blocks. The heads were hand-fitted. The valve geometry was modified in a way that Derek had read about exactly once in a technical journal article about an engineer named Raymond Costello, who had worked for 3 different American automakers between 1957 and 1974 before disappearing into obscurity. The article had described a series of experimental engines Costello had built during the late 1960s, hand-assembled, one-of-a-kind prototype power units that tested manufacturing concepts the industry wouldn't catch up to for another 20 years. The article had noted that the whereabouts of Costello's experimental engines were unknown. Derek sat back on his heels and looked at the engine for a long time. He took very careful photographs. Then he went back to the house and found the article online. It had been published in an automotive heritage journal behind a paywall he paid $12 to get past. And read it again, twice. The machining signatures, the specific modifications to the oiling system, the custom valve covers. It matched. Not sort of matched. Matched. He closed his laptop and sat at his kitchen table for several minutes. Then he got up, made a second cup of coffee, and went back to the barn. Over the following 10 days, he worked through the other 9 vehicles. 2 of them turned out to be straightforward, salvageable bodies with useful parts, worth restoring for resale, but nothing remarkable. A third had an extremely well-preserved original interior under a disgusting aftermarket cover job, which had value to the right collector, but wasn't the kind of thing that rearranged your understanding of what you were dealing with. The 4th and 5th vehicles were where it started to get strange. The 4th was a 1971 Plymouth Cuda, one of the most collected American muscle cars in history, which alone wasn't remarkable, since plenty of Cudas had rusted into obscurity. What was remarkable was the build sheet Derek found folded inside the trunk-mounted spare tire, sealed in a plastic bag that had kept it nearly pristine. The build sheet documented a factory configuration that shouldn't have existed, a combination of high-performance options that Chrysler's records indicated had never been produced as a combination, not a custom order, not an aftermarket modification. Factory. He photographed the build sheet and sent the images to a Mopar historian he knew through an online forum. The man's response came back in 40 minutes. "Where did you find this?" "I am not joking. This is the car from the Burlington records. Everyone thought it was crushed. Where did you find this?" The 5th vehicle, bought a battered 1967 Chevrolet Camaro with no engine, had been tagged at the factory with a racing department code that indicated it had been part of an experimental program that Chevrolet had officially denied running until a series of internal documents had been released 3 years ago. The car was documented. Its history was documented. It had just been lost. By day 15, Derek had stopped sleeping a normal number of hours. Not because he was panicking, because the more he found, the more he needed to know, and knowing required time. And time at night was the only time Caleb was asleep, and the garage was quiet, and he could spread papers across the hood of whatever he was working on and read without interruption. He told nobody what he was finding, not Yvonne, not Earl, not the guys at the forum, beyond the initial inquiry about the build sheet. The internet, meanwhile, had moved on from him mostly. The video had plateaued at around 1.2 million views, which was apparently not enough to sustain a news cycle, and the comments had quieted down to a low background hum of mockery that you could ignore if you were busy enough. He was very busy. Itul said. The first outside contact came on day 18. He was in the barn working on the Charger's engine when his phone rang, an unknown number, area code 313, which was Detroit. "Is this Derek Vaughn?" A man's voice, careful, professional. "Who's asking?" "My name is Thomas Reyes. I'm the Acquisitions Director for the American Automotive Heritage Foundation in Dearborn. I apologize for calling out of the blue. I got your number from an individual on a collector forum who mentioned you might have acquired some vehicles from the Callaway County auction." Derek didn't say anything for a moment. "I just want to be clear that we're in early conversations," Reyes said carefully. I want to be honest with you, Mr. Vaughn. We don't have a specific vehicle in mind. We're just doing due diligence on a few recent auctions in the region." "What kind of due diligence?" "We like to stay ahead of significant finds. If you found something historically important and you're considering what to do with it, we'd like to be part of that conversation." Derek looked at the engine in front of him. "How did you hear about Callaway County?" A pause. "Collectors talk, Mr. Vaughn. These things get around. I'll keep that in mind, Derek said. I'm not at a point where I'm having conversations yet. Of course, of course. May I call you again in, say, 10 days? Sure, Derek said. He hung up and looked at the engine for another moment. Then he got up and went to the house and looked at the article about Raymond Costello again. And this time he noticed something he'd skimmed past before. A single line near the end, almost an afterthought. Costello's daughter, Eleanor, has stated that she believes at least some of her father's experimental work still exists in private hands, and she has indicated a willingness to assist in authenticated identification of his engines should any come to light. There was a contact email for the journal. He sent a message that night. Ook. The call from Eleanor Costello came 3 days later. She was 81 years old. Her voice was precise and dry and completely unhurried, the voice of someone who has stopped rushing toward anything. You say you have one of my father's engines, she said. It wasn't a question. It wasn't quite a statement. It occupied the space between. I believe I might, Derek said. Describe the valve covers. He described them. Silence for a long moment. The secondary oiling channel, she said. Look at the left side of the block below the third bolt boss. He went and looked. There's a stamping, he said. Looks like initials and a number, RC and then 7. The silence on the other end of the line was a different quality this time. That's the 7th engine, she said. He built 9 of them. The 7th one, my father talked about the 7th one specifically. He said it was the one that worked exactly the way he intended. Mrs. Costello. Miss, she said, I never married, and you need to understand something, Mr. Vaughn. My father worked for 40 years in this industry and retired with nothing but a small pension and a workshop full of tools that my cousin sold when he died. He built things that other men received patents for. He built things that ended up in vehicles that made other men wealthy. The engines he built on his own time, at his own expense, were the things he was proudest of in his life. Derek stood very still in the barn. The 7th one disappeared in 1971, she said. He never knew what happened to it. He thought someone had stolen it. We thought so too. It wasn't stolen, Derek said slowly. Or if it was, it ended up in a car, a '69 Charger. Someone put it in and painted over it, and the car sat in a field somewhere. 53 years, she said. Something like that. He could hear her breathing on the other end of the line. I would like to see it, she said. I'd like you to, he said. Give me a couple more weeks. On day 22, a second call came in from a collector in Nashville who offered $180,000 for the Plymouth with the build sheet, subject to authentication. On day 24, a museum in Detroit called about the Camaro. They were careful about numbers, but they weren't careful enough to hide that they were serious. On day 26, Derek had a message waiting from a private collector in Germany who had apparently heard about the build sheet situation through channels Derek couldn't trace, and who was willing to discuss terms that would have made the Nashville offer look modest. He responded to none of them. Not yet. He was still working. The Charger was stripped to the frame now. He knew every weld. He knew the history written in metal and rust and the evidence of decades of weather. He'd found 2 more of Costello's stamps. The man had initialed his work in hidden places, like a signature inside a painting. On day 28, he called Eleanor Costello back. I'm going to make you an offer, he said. Not a sale, an arrangement. She listened. When this is authenticated and the history is documented, he said, I want your father's name on it. Not as a footnote, as the primary attribution. Whatever happens to this engine, museum, auction, whatever, it goes as a Raymond Costello original. Is that something you'd want? She was quiet for so long he thought he might have lost the connection. Yes, she said. That is something I would want very much. Then we have an arrangement. Man. On day 29, the story leaked. He didn't know how. Possibly the Nashville collector had talked. Possibly the forum had connected more dots than he'd realized. But by evening, there were 2 messages from automotive journalists, a call from a producer at a cable automotive show, and at 9:47 p.m., while he was reading the same page of Caleb's bedtime book for the 3rd time because he kept losing his place, a text from an unknown number that turned out to be Sienna Ashcroft's personal cell phone. I need to speak with you, please. He stared at the message for a while. He put his phone face down on Caleb's nightstand and finished the chapter. After Caleb was asleep, He sat in the kitchen with his phone on the table in front of him and thought about the woman who had stood in front of a crowd and made a joke about his son's college fund. He thought about it for a while. Then he typed, "Tomorrow, my garage, 10 a.m." The response came back in 11 seconds. "I'll be there." He put his phone in his pocket and went back out to the barn. He had work to finish before morning. The air inside the barn smelled like metal shavings and WD-40 and the faint chemical sweetness of rust converter. The 10 vehicles sat in their rows, documented now, their surfaces stripped of years of grime, their histories beginning to emerge the way a photograph emerges in Developer. Slowly, then all at once. Derek stood in the center of it and looked at what 30 days of work had uncovered. Not treasure, exactly. Not the kind you find in movies, no chest of gold, no single dramatic discovery. Something more complicated and more interesting than that. A set of overlooked things that turned out to matter. A forgotten engineer's life's work, hidden inside a car that looked like nothing. A documented history that collectors in museums and a woman in Germany had all apparently been looking for, in one form or another, and nobody had found because nobody had looked at the right angle. He'd looked at the right angle. Not because he was smarter than the people who'd walked past, because he was slower, because he had a habit of crouching down when other people were standing up and looking at fasteners when other people were looking at paint, and because 30 years of his life, his father's garage, the community college nights, 12 years of working on other people's broken things, had taught him what right and wrong looked like at a granular level that didn't translate into anything you could put on a business card or a press release or a magazine profile. He turned off the barn light and walked back toward the house. Tomorrow would be a different kind of day. But tonight, the work was done, and the barn was dark, and 10 forgotten cars sat waiting in the silence, and that was enough. She came alone. That was the first thing Derek noticed when he heard the car pull up the gravel drive at 9:58 in the morning. He was under the Charger's rear end, checking a brake line he'd been meaning to get to since day 3, and he slid out from under it when he heard the engine. A quiet, well-tuned thing, not a town car or an SUV with a driver, just a car. A dark gray Porsche Cayenne parked without fanfare next to his truck. No associates, no clipboard people. Sienna Ashcroft got out of the car by herself, and for a moment she just stood there looking at the exterior of his garage with an expression he couldn't quite read from 20 feet away. She was dressed differently from the auction, not expensive casual this time, but just regular. Dark jeans, a plain jacket, hair down. She looked like someone who had spent some time thinking about what to wear to a thing like this, and had eventually landed on trying not to look like she was trying. Derek stood up and wiped his hands. She saw him and walked over, and he noticed she looked tired. Not sick, not disheveled. Just the kind of tired that accumulates behind a person's eyes when they've been carrying something for a while and not sleeping well. "Mr. Vaughn," she said. "Derek." A small pause. "Sienna." He nodded toward the barn. "Come in." He didn't offer coffee. He didn't make small talk. He just walked toward the barn and held the door open, and she came inside, and he watched her face when the overhead lights came on, and she saw what was in front of her. She stopped walking. The 10 vehicles were arranged the way he'd had them since day 5. 2 rows of 5, each one partially disassembled, with documentation spread on work tables between them. Photographs, identification sheets, correspondence printouts clipped together in labeled folders. The barn smelled like work, real work, the kind that leaves a physical residue. "You did all this in 30 days, she said. It wasn't quite a question. 29, he said. "I'm still working." She moved slowly into the space, looking at each vehicle in turn without touching anything. He let her look. He didn't narrate or explain, which was something she'd later tell him she hadn't expected. Most people, when they have something to show off, can't stop talking about it. She stopped at the Charger. The engine was on a stand now, pulled from the engine bay for documentation and assessment. Under the shop lights, the hand-machined surfaces caught the light differently from cast components. There was a precision to the surfaces that you either knew how to see or you didn't. "This is what everyone's calling about," she said quietly. "Part of it." She turned to look at him. "What did your evaluator miss?" "He didn't look inside the engine compartment long enough," Derek said. "He was moving at auction preview speed. You see surfaces at that speed, you don't see what's behind them. And you did. I move slower than most people. She looked at him. That's not a technical answer. No, he agreed. It's not. She walked to the work table where he had the documentation spread out. The photographs, the correspondence with Thomas Reyes at the Heritage Foundation, the printed article about Raymond Costello, the notes from his call with Eleanor. She looked at it the way a person looks at something when they're trying to understand not just what it is, but what it means that they missed it. My evaluator has 22 years of experience, she said, not defensively, more like she was working through a math problem. I know. I looked him up. That surprised her slightly. Then you know he's not someone who makes basic errors. He didn't make a basic error, Derek said. He made a speed error. Those are different things. He came in with a verdict already forming, a lot of junk, nothing worth our time, and he confirmed it instead of investigating it. That's not stupidity. That's efficiency. It just happened to be wrong in this case. She was quiet for a moment. She picked up the printed article about Costello, carefully, at the edges, and read the first few paragraphs. He watched her eyes move through the text. How did you know to look for this specific thing? She asked, still reading. I didn't, he said. I didn't know what I was looking for. I knew something was different. I went looking for what? She set the article down. There's a difference between those two things. Yeah. Most people would have looked for what it was and stopped when they couldn't identify it easily. Most people have other things to do, Derek said. She turned to face him fully. In the barn light, with no sunglasses and no associates and no crowd to perform for, she looked younger than she had at the auction and simultaneously more serious, like the version of her that existed before the one the world mostly saw. I want to buy the collection, she said, before it goes public. I know that's why you came. I can offer it. I know what you can offer, he said. The Heritage Foundation called me 11 days ago. 2 private collectors since then. A museum in Detroit. Someone in Germany who I think might be connected to a manufacturer, but I'm not certain yet. He looked at her steadily. I have a fairly good sense of the number by now. Something shifted in her expression. Then you know the offer I'm about to make is competitive. I know it's serious, he said. I'm not saying it isn't. But I haven't decided to sell the collection as a package to a single buyer, he said. And I haven't decided that the right outcome is for all of this to disappear into someone's private inventory, even someone who would take good care of it. She crossed her arms, not in a hostile way, more like she was physically containing whatever she was about to say next, editing herself. What do you want, then? Derek looked at the Charger engine on its stand. He thought about Eleanor Costello, 81 years old, her father's stamps hidden inside a block of metal for 53 years. He thought about Caleb asking how you know if it's a good car when nobody else thinks so. I want Raymond Costello's name on his own work, he said. I want this documented so it can't be undone. And I want the cars to end up somewhere. Their history means something, not just their dollar value. Sienna looked at him for a long moment. That's not a business position, she said. No, he said, it's not. You could make significantly more money by taking the best offer on each individual vehicle. I know. And you're not going to do that. I don't know yet what I'm going to do, he said honestly. I wanted to talk to you before I decided anything. You came in early at the auction. Your team saw these vehicles. And you're here now, which means something to you changed between then and now. I wanted to hear what. She looked at him as if he'd said something unexpected, which apparently he had. She was quiet for a moment, and in the quiet, the barn settled around them. The small sounds of metal and wood, the distant noise of a truck on the county road. My chief technical evaluator, she said, called me on day 21 of your project. He'd heard the same forum conversations you heard from. He came back and told me he thought he'd missed something at the Callaway auction. She paused. He is not someone who admits errors easily. For him to call me directly and say what he said, that mattered. What did he say? He said he thought there might be a Costello engine in one of the lots that went unsold until you bought them, and that if there was, the engine had a heritage value that was, his word was significant. She said the word with a precision that suggested she was quoting exactly. He said he should have looked harder. He should have, Derek said, without cruelty. Yes. She said it simply, without defending the man. He should have. And I should have looked instead of... She stopped. The moment sat between them. You made a joke, Derek said. I made a joke, she agreed. Her voice was flat and precise and entirely without excuse. In front of a crowd. About your son. He didn't say anything. I want to be honest with you about something, she said. It wasn't a calculated thing. I'm not standing here telling you I'm a terrible person because it serves a business purpose. I said something stupid, and I've been thinking about it every day since. Has that affected your sleep? He asked. It was a dry question, and she heard the dryness in it, her mouth pressed together slightly. Yes, actually. Good, he said. Then, I don't mean that in a vicious way, I just think it should have. It did. He nodded once and turned back toward the work table. He'd learned early in his life from his father, a man of limited words and specific expectations, that a person's apology was only as good as what they did with the thing they were apologizing for. Words were the beginning of a sentence, not the end of one. Come look at the Plymouth, he said. There's something in the trunk. She followed him to the CUDA. He'd preserved the build sheet in an archival sleeve now, but he laid it on the work table and showed her what it meant, explaining the option codes and why their combination was significant. She was a better listener than he'd expected, not performing attentiveness, but actually following the technical thread, asking clarifying questions when she didn't understand something, not asking them when she did. How do you know all this? She asked at one point. Forums, mostly. Books. I've been reading about this stuff since I was a kid. Your father was a mechanic? He had a shop in Pineville. He paused. He died when I was 24. I'm sorry. He would have known what this engine was, Derek said, looking at the charger block. Faster than me, probably. He was better at intuiting things than I am. I have to work for it. She was quiet for a moment. My father built cars, she said. He didn't know how cars worked. He knew how to make people want them. Those are different skills. They are. He thought the making was less important than the selling. She said it without bitterness, or with bitterness that had been so thoroughly processed it had become something else. I spent a lot of years trying to figure out which of us was right. And? I think he was wrong, she said. I think he was enormously successful, and I loved him, and he was wrong about that specific thing. Derek looked at her. This was not what he had expected from this conversation. He'd expected negotiation. He'd expected the sophisticated management of a business situation by someone who was very good at managing things. He hadn't expected her to say something true about her father in a barn in Harlan County, Kentucky, to a man she'd publicly mocked 3 weeks ago. He wasn't entirely sure what to do with it. The foundation in Dearborn, he said after a moment. They've been the most straightforward with me. No agenda I can identify beyond preservation. I know Thomas Reyes, she said. He's honest. He'll do what he says. I know, but the foundation doesn't have the resources to restore. They preserve and document. That's valuable, but it's not the whole picture. He looked at the charger. This engine deserves to run again, not in a show car. Actually run. Under load, the way Costello designed it to. She looked at the engine block for a long moment. He could see her thinking, not performing thinking, but actually running through something. I have a restoration division, she said slowly. I know. We do historically significant vehicles. Commission work mostly. We've done some heritage projects for museums. I know I looked at your company before you got here. She turned to look at him, and this time there was something in her expression he hadn't seen from her yet. Not quite amusement, but the precursor to it. You researched me. You came to my garage, he said. I wanted to know who I was talking to. And what did you find? That your restoration division is good, he said. Genuinely good. That you have people who care about accuracy, and that your company has enough visibility that whatever you put your name on, people pay attention to. She was quiet for a moment. You're thinking about a partnership. I'm thinking out loud, he said. I haven't decided anything. But you invited me here. I invited you here to hear what you had to say. He looked at her directly. I've heard it. Now I need to think. She took that with better grace than he'd expected. Most people in his experience didn't take being told to wait very well. She just nodded, once. "Can I ask you one more thing?" she said. "Go ahead." "You knew, or you strongly suspected, that you had something significant before the auction ended. You had time to say something, to make an argument, to push back on what I said to that crowd." She paused. "Why didn't you?" Derek looked at the floor of the barn for a moment. The question was a fair one. He'd thought about it himself in the weeks since. "Because I didn't know yet," he said. "I had a feeling, a strong one. But feelings aren't facts, and I wasn't going to stand in front of a crowd and make a claim I couldn't back up. That's not who I am." Most people would have said something anyway, to defend themselves. "I know. But you just loaded the trailer. I had work to do," he said simply. "Everything I needed to say, I was going to say by doing the work." That seemed like enough. She looked at him for a long moment. He couldn't tell what she was thinking, and he didn't try to guess. People are mostly unreadable when they're being honest, in his experience, because honesty doesn't perform as clearly as its alternatives. "Okay," she said finally. "Think. I'll wait." She said it straightforwardly, without transaction in her voice, and that was when something small but real shifted in how Derek was looking at this situation. He walked her back to her car. She paused before getting in. "The boy in the video, your son, Caleb. How old?" 7. She nodded. She looked like she was going to say something else, then didn't. She got in the car and backed down the driveway and turned out onto the county road, and he watched the gray Porsche disappear around the bend in the trees. He stood there for a moment in the morning quiet. Then he went back into the barn. He had 3 calls to return and a decision to start building toward, and the Charger's brake line was still waiting, and Caleb got out of school at 3:15 and needed help with a math worksheet that had been sitting on the kitchen table since Tuesday. He picked up his work light and slid back under the car. The decision could take shape while his hands were busy. That was usually how his best thinking happened anyway. Not at a table with a piece of paper, but horizontal on a creeper with metal above his face, turning a problem over in the same methodical way he turned a wrench. One angle, then another, until something loosened. The brake line was in worse shape than he'd initially thought. He made a note of what he'd need and added it to the running parts list he kept tacked to the wall near the toolbox. Then he lay there in the dim space under the Charger and thought about Eleanor Costello, who had waited 53 years to find out what happened to her father's 7th engine. And he thought about Thomas Reyes at the Heritage Foundation, who had called him with the careful manner of a man trying not to show how much he wanted something. And he thought about the collector in Germany and the museum in Detroit and all the institutional interest that had materialized around 10 vehicles that a room full of experienced people had walked away from 3 weeks ago. He thought about Sienna Ashcroft saying, "I think he was wrong about her father," in a tone that suggested it had cost her something to arrive at that conclusion. He thought about Caleb's worksheet on the kitchen table. He slid out from under the car, stood up, and went to the wall phone. He kept a landline in the barn for exactly the reason he was about to use it, which was that his cell signal was unreliable under certain weather conditions, and you didn't want to lose a call in the middle of something important. He dialed Thomas Reyes at the Heritage Foundation. "Mr. Vaughn," Reyes answered on the second ring, the way a man answers when he's been waiting. "I want to talk about what a documentation first process would look like," Derek said. "Before any sale discussions, before any public statement. Eleanor Costello needs to be involved in the authentication of the engine, and her father's contribution needs to be the primary attribution in any public record. That's not negotiable." A brief pause. "We can work within those parameters. And I want the process documented publicly as it happens. Not after, during. I want people to be able to watch what authentication looks like when it's done right." Another pause, longer this time. "That's unusual." "I know. May I ask why?" Derek looked at the Charger engine on its stand across the barn. "Because these things disappear into private hands and nobody learns anything from them," he said. "I'd rather it meant something to more people than just the ones who own it." Reyes was quiet for a moment. "I think we can discuss that," he said carefully. "It would require some coordination." "I know. I'm not asking you to decide today. I'm asking you to think about whether your institution is the right partner for something structured that way. I'll think about it, Reyes said. Good. Derek paused. I had a meeting this morning with Sienna Ashcroft. A beat of silence. Ashcroft Automotive. Yes. That's... Reyes stopped, started again. That's an interesting development. She has a restoration division with technical capability I don't have on my own. Her company has visibility. If this is going to be done publicly and done right, having multiple institutional partners might be the correct structure. You're talking about a consortium arrangement. I don't know what I'm talking about yet, Derek said honestly. I'm talking out loud to a man I trust to tell me if what I'm saying doesn't make sense. A surprised pause. Then quietly, I appreciate that, Mr. Vaughn. I'll call you in 4 days, Derek said. He hung up and stood for a moment in the barn. Outside, the afternoon was moving toward school dismissal time. He had an hour and 20 minutes before Caleb's bus, which was enough time to start disassembling the Camaro's front suspension, which needed documentation before he could assess what it would cost to bring it back properly. He picked up his tools. He wasn't someone who dealt well in abstraction for long periods. The thinking was necessary, but it had to be tethered to something physical, something with weight and resistance. Ideas without a workbench under them tended to float in directions that were no use to anyone. He worked on the Camaro until 20 minutes before the bus, then cleaned up and drove to the end of the county road to wait. Caleb got off the bus with his backpack hanging off one shoulder at an angle that suggested something heavy had shifted inside it, and a smear of what looked like poster paint on the back of his left hand. How was it? Derek asked. We made turkeys, Caleb said, out of paper bags for the classroom display. Is it November already? It was Mrs. Garrett's idea. She says we're getting ahead of the seasons. Caleb considered this. I don't know what that means. It means she's organized, Derek said. They drove home. Caleb ate a bowl of cereal because he claimed he was too hungry to wait for dinner, but not hungry enough to wait for something real, which was logic Derek decided not to argue with. Then Caleb sat at the kitchen table with his math worksheet, and Derek sat across from him with a coffee that had gone cold 20 minutes ago, and they worked through it together. Multiplication problems that Caleb had convinced himself were harder than they were, which was a pattern Derek recognized because it was exactly the same pattern he himself followed with paperwork. The lady came today, Caleb said without looking up from the worksheet. Derek looked at him. What lady? The one from the video. I saw her car in the driveway when Yvonne brought me home the other day. He paused. Was it her? Yeah. What did she want? To talk. Caleb wrote a number in a box on the worksheet and looked at it critically. Did she say sorry? In her way. What does that mean? Derek thought about how to explain it to a 7-year-old and decided that the accurate version was the better version. Some people are better at doing sorry than saying it, he said. She said it, but I think the doing is still coming. Caleb nodded as if this made complete sense, which to him it apparently did. Like when I broke your screwdriver and I said sorry, but I was still scared. A little like that, yeah. I bought you a new one with my birthday money. You did. That was the doing part. Caleb looked at his worksheet and wrote another number. So what's she gonna do? Derek picked up his cold coffee and drank it. That's the part I'm trying to figure out, he said. The evenings settled in the way evenings did in that house. Slowly, with the small routines that make a life feel like a life rather than a series of disconnected events. Dinner. Dishes. The argument about bedtime that happened every single night with the reliability of a scheduled event, though neither of them would have eliminated it if they could. After Caleb was asleep, Derek sat at the kitchen table with a notepad and a pen and started writing things down. Not calculations, not a business plan, just things he knew and things he didn't know yet, and questions he needed to answer before he could make a decision he could live with. He'd always thought better on paper than in his head. His head held too many variables at once, and they crowded each other. Paper forced him to commit. He wrote, "What does Eleanor Costello need from this?" He wrote, "What does the Charger deserve?" He wrote, "What does Caleb need from the next 3 years?" He wrote, "What does the work mean if it disappears?" He looked at the 4 questions for a while. Then he added a 5th. What happens if I get this wrong? He sat with that one for a long time. Getting it wrong meant the cars scattered. the Charger engine in a private collection in Germany, the Plymouth build sheet in a drawer somewhere, the Camaro in a museum basement where it would be correctly labeled and never seen. It meant Raymond Costello's name in a footnote, if it appeared at all. It meant a decent sum of money that would cover Caleb's needs and his own for a while. And a story that the internet had already written and would never unwrite. The man who spent his last dollar on 10 piles of rust. He crossed out the fifth question, not because it wasn't worth asking, but because the answer to it was already shaping the answers to the first four, and that was probably the order it needed to happen in. He wrote one more thing at the bottom of the page, call Sienna. Then he folded the paper and put it in his shirt pocket and went to bed. He lay in the dark, staring at the water-stained ceiling of his bedroom, the Texas-shaped one, and thought about a man named Raymond Costello who had built 9 engines by hand, each one better than the last, and had died without knowing where the 7th one was, and about his daughter, 81 years old, who had been waiting for the phone to ring, and about the fact that in 6 days the story was going to be public whether Derek controlled the timing or not because the Nashville Collector had already talked too much to too many people, and the forum conversations were getting more specific, and the automotive press was circling with the patient persistence that characterizes institutions that are used to waiting for things to become undeniable. He had 6 days to build a structure that could hold the weight of what he'd found. He fell asleep with his hand still in a loose fist from holding the pen, and he dreamed about his father's shop in Pineville, the smell of it, the specific quality of light through the high windows, the sound of the radio his father kept on the shelf above the lift. He dreamed about being 8 years old and handing his father a wrench and his father saying, without looking up, "You can tell everything about a car by where it's holding its tension." He'd been 8. He hadn't understood what that meant. He was 32 now, and he was beginning to. He called Sienna at 7:15 the next morning. She answered on the second ring, which told him she'd been awake for a while. People who sleep well don't answer phones that fast at 7 in the morning. "I want to propose something," he said, without preamble. "Not a sale, a structure." A brief pause. "I'm listening." Eleanor Costello needs to be in the room when the engine is authenticated. Not on a phone call, not receiving a report after the fact, physically present. She's 81 and she lives in Dayton, Ohio, and someone needs to arrange for her to get here. "I can do that," Sienna said. "I'm not finished." "Sorry, go ahead." The Heritage Foundation does the authentication. Thomas Reyes and his team, with Eleanor present. Your restoration division gets access to the Charger afterward, not ownership, access, to document what an accurate restoration of a Costello engine would require. That documentation becomes part of the public record. He heard her shift on her end of the line. "You're talking about making the process transparent." "I'm talking about making it mean something beyond the transaction," he said. "The Plymouth goes to the Mopar Historical Registry. That's already where it belongs, and I think Reyes agrees. The Camaro, I'm still working through that one, but there are people who've been looking for it for a long time, and it should go somewhere it can be seen. And the others? The others are good vehicles that need work," he said. "Some I'll restore and sell. Some maybe your division takes on as commissions. We can talk about the specifics, but those aren't the complicated ones." She was quiet for a moment. He could hear her thinking, or maybe that was just the silence of an early morning in whatever city she was in. He didn't know where she'd gone after leaving Harlan County. Back to Detroit, maybe. Back to the architecture of her regular life. "What do you get from this structure?" she asked. It wasn't an accusation. It was a real question, asked with the directness of someone who had learned to separate what people said they wanted from what the arrangement actually gave them. "Documentation that I did the work correctly," he said. "A fair price on the vehicles that sell, which Reyes can help establish. And my name on the restoration work I do, same as Costello's name on his engine. That last part matters to you." "It matters to me." Another pause. "Okay," she said, "but I need something in return." "What?" "I need to be present for the authentication, not as a buyer, not as competition, just present, so I understand what was missed and why." He hadn't expected that. He'd expected a counteroffer about pricing, or access terms, or marketing rights. Not that. "Why?" he said. "Because I sent an evaluator who didn't look hard enough, and I stood in front of a crowd and made it worse, and I need to understand the full size of the mistake." Her voice was even and clear and carried no self-pity. "I can't fix the public part, but I can understand the professional part, if you let me." He stood in his kitchen with the morning light coming through the window above the sink, looking at the gravel driveway and the entrance to his barn. "Authentication is in 5 days," he said. "Reyes is flying in from Dearborn. Eleanor Costello needs travel arrangements by tomorrow morning to give her enough time." "I'll have someone call her today," Sienna said. "Not someone. You call her." A beat of silence. "Okay." "She's not a logistical problem, she's a person. Her father's name is the whole point of this. She gets to hear that from you directly." He heard something in the silence that he couldn't name exactly. Not offense, not resistance. More like the particular quality of a person recognizing that they've just been handed a fair requirement and that fairness is occasionally inconvenient. "I'll call her today," she said. "Good. I'll send you her number." He hung up and texted the number and went to wake Caleb up for school. The next 5 days were the strangest of the whole 30, which was saying something, because weeks 2 and 3 had contained their own category of strangeness. The barn was a controlled space now, Derek's space, organized around his system, documented the way he wanted it documented. But the world outside it was starting to lean in. The automotive journalist who'd left a message called back. Then another one. A blogger who covered classic American muscle had somehow gotten enough specific details to write a piece that was accurate in all the ways that mattered, and therefore spread fast through the collector community. Derek didn't confirm or deny anything in it. He answered 2 calls with no comment and let the rest go to voicemail. Yvonne, who served as his informal intelligence source on what the internet was doing, reported that the original video had found new momentum. People were cross-referencing the auction footage with the blog post and making connections. And the comment sections had begun to shift in tone from mockery to something more complicated, the way public opinion shifts when the story turns out to be different from the first version. "People are starting to say you knew what you were doing," Yvonne told him, sitting at his kitchen table eating the last of Caleb's cereal. "People," Derek said, "are catching up. The woman who laughed at you is getting dragged now, like, significantly." He refilled his coffee. "That's not the point." "I know that's not the point," Yvonne said, "but you have to admit it's a little satisfying." "It's a little satisfying," he acknowledged. "Go home, Yvonne." She did not immediately go home. She ate 3 more spoonfuls of cereal, but she went eventually. He called Eleanor Costello to check in and found that Sienna had indeed called her personally that afternoon, and that Eleanor had described the conversation as professional and unexpectedly genuine, which Derek filed away as useful information about who Sienna actually was when the performance fell away. Eleanor was coming on Thursday. She'd booked a train because she didn't fly, hadn't since 1987, a fact she delivered without explanation, and he didn't ask for one. Sienna's assistant had arranged a car from the Lexington station. Thomas Reyes arrived Wednesday evening. Derek met him at a diner on Route 119 for coffee, and the man was exactly what his phone voice suggested. Mid-50s, precise, the kind of careful that comes from caring about getting things right, rather than caring about looking right. He had a quiet intensity about the Costello engine that Derek respected, the intensity of a person who has been in a field long enough to understand that truly significant finds are rare and that treating them carelessly is a failure of responsibility. "I've been in contact with 3 universities," Reyes said, turning his coffee cup in his hands. "There's enough existing documentation on Costello's work to make a solid authentication case. Eleanor Costello's testimony will be central. She worked in her father's shop as a young woman. She knows the methodology. And your photographic documentation is excellent, by the way. It's the kind of record that makes authentication defensible in the long run." "What does the long run look like?" Derek asked. "For the engine?" Reyes set down his cup. "There'll be interest from at least 2 major automotive museums once this is public. There'll be private collector offers that will be larger than the institutional ones. The question is what outcome you want." "What outcome do you want?" Derek asked. Reyes looked at him. "I want it in public hands. I think that's what Costello would have wanted. He wasn't building those engines to make money. He had a career for that. He was building them because the engineering itself mattered to him." "Then we want the same thing," Derek said. Reyes nodded slowly. "Ms. Ashcroft's involvement complicates the optics somewhat," he said, choosing his words with the care of someone navigating a professional minefield. I know. She represents a competing set of interests. She represented a competing set of interests, Derek said. I think she's revising her position. Reyes looked at him for a moment. You trust her? Derek thought about it honestly. I trust that she knows what a mistake costs her, and that she's smart enough not to make the same one twice. That's not the same as trust, exactly. But it's enough for now. Reyes seemed to accept this. He picked up his coffee again. Tomorrow, he said. I'd like to spend several hours with the vehicles before Eleanor arrives. Can you arrange that? I'll be there at 7, Derek said. They finished their coffee and Derek drove home through the dark of the county road, the familiar landmarks of his regular life. The fence line that Earl Compton had been meaning to fix for 2 years, the mailbox that leaned at a permanent 15 degrees, the light in Yvonne's window. He pulled into the driveway and sat in the truck for a moment before going inside. He was tired in a way that had accumulated over 30 days of inadequate sleep and sustained intensity and the particular emotional weight of trying to do something right in public when the public had already decided what you were. The tired didn't feel bad exactly. It felt like the tired of a long project approaching its pivot point when the work you've done either holds or it doesn't. He went inside and checked on Caleb and went to bed. Thursday arrived gray and cold with a low fog that sat in the valley and didn't burn off until almost noon. Sienna got there first, at 8:30, in the same gray Porsche. She was dressed practically, real work clothes this time, not performative practical but expensive, actual practical. Boots with grip, dark pants with pockets. She'd worked in a factory once, or something adjacent to one, and it showed in the way she moved through a workspace. She didn't brush things with her hands or hover over components. She moved efficiently and stayed out of the way. Reyes was already in the barn with Derek, working through a methodical visual inspection of the Charger engine and dictating notes into a small recorder. He acknowledged Sienna with a professional nod and went back to what he was doing. She stood near the door and watched without talking, which was the right instinct. Eleanor Costello arrived at 11:15. The car from Lexington pulled up the gravel drive and Derek went out to meet it, and an 81-year-old woman got out with the careful deliberateness of someone managing a body that has started requiring negotiation, but stood completely upright once she was on her feet and looked at the barn with an expression that was impossible to read and therefore entirely honest. She was small, white-haired, with the bone structure of someone who had probably been striking at 30 and had aged into a different kind of striking. She wore a coat that was 20 years old and well-maintained and carried a leather satchel that was older than that. Mr. Vaughn, she said. Miss Costello. He shook her hand. Her grip was firm, and her hand was cold from the drive. The engine is inside? Yes. Then let's not stand in the cold, she said, and walked toward the barn. He followed her in. She didn't rush toward the Charger engine. She moved through the barn the way Reyes had, methodically, looking at everything in the space before focusing on the specific thing. She looked at the Plymouth with the build sheet. She looked at the Camaro. She looked at the work table with the documentation spread across it, pausing to read several of the sheets. Then she looked at Sienna, who was standing near the far wall. You're the woman from the auction video, Eleanor said. It wasn't an accusation, it was a statement, with the pure neutral delivery of someone who says what they observe and waits to see what the observation produces. Sienna met her eyes. Yes. Eleanor regarded her for a moment. Then she nodded once with the expression of someone who has filed something in the correct folder and turned toward the Charger engine. She looked at it for a long time without speaking. Reyes stood nearby with his recorder turned off, giving her the space. Derek stood by the door with his hands in his jacket pockets. Sienna didn't move. Eleanor reached into her satchel and brought out a pair of reading glasses and put them on. Then she leaned close to the block, looking at the machining. She moved to the valve covers. She looked at the oiling modification on the left side, the side below the third bolt boss where the stamps were. When she found the RC7 marking, she put 2 fingers on it, gently, carefully, the way you'd touch something you'd been looking for a long time and weren't entirely sure was real. She didn't say anything for almost a minute. Then she straightened up and took her glasses off and put them back in the satchel. It's my father's, she said. Her voice was steady. The seventh. He always said the seventh was the one that came out exactly right. Reyes made a small sound that wasn't quite a word, the professional equivalent of exhaling. How did you know to look at the firewall? Eleanor asked Derek. The shadow was wrong, he said. When I propped the hood during the preview, the way the light fell inside the engine compartment, it didn't match the rest of the car. The shadow was wrong, she repeated slowly. The block was machined differently. It sits differently than a stock component. The light catches at a different angle. She looked at him over the top of her satchel. My father would have said the same thing, she said. He used to say that a well-machined engine has its own light, that if you look at two components in the same conditions, the precise one catches the light better because there's less imperfection for light to get lost in. She paused. I thought it was a romantic thing he said because he loved his work. I didn't know it was literally true until just now. Derek didn't say anything. Thank you, she said. Not the social version, the real one. Yes, ma'am. The authentication process took the rest of the day. Reyes worked with a thoroughness that Derek found genuinely admirable, cross-referencing his photographic documentation against the archival materials the Heritage Foundation had on Costello's methodology, recording Eleanor's testimony about the specific construction techniques her father had used, noting the machining signatures on each component. Sienna, to her credit, participated only when asked, answering a question from Reyes about period-accurate manufacturing tolerances that was squarely in her area of expertise, but otherwise observing. By 4 in the afternoon, Reyes had enough for a preliminary authentication that he said would survive professional scrutiny. A full report would take 3 weeks to prepare properly, but the finding itself was clear. This is Raymond Costello's 7th experimental engine, Reyes said, in the measured tone of a man making a formal statement, even in an informal setting. It is, to our knowledge, the most intact of his surviving experimental works, and it is in a condition that would permit careful restoration to operational status. Eleanor was sitting in the camp chair Derek had brought out for her an hour ago, her satchel on her lap. She had said very little during the afternoon portion of the authentication, but had listened to everything. What happens to it now? She asked. Derek and Reyes exchanged a look. That depends on several conversations that are still in progress, Derek said carefully. But you have a position, Eleanor said. You had a position before I got here. I'd like to hear it. He hadn't planned on explaining the whole structure to her today. He'd thought he'd have more time to work through the specifics. But she was 81, and she had taken a train, and she had just spent 5 hours in a cold barn confirming that her father's lost work was real and present, and she'd asked him a direct question. The engine should stay in public hands, he said. One of the major automotive museums, Reyes has 2 in mind, with a permanent attribution to your father, not a footnote, a primary credit. The vehicle itself, the Charger, would ideally be restored as part of a documented project. That restoration record becomes part of the artifact, so people can understand not just what the engine is, but what it took to find it and bring it back. She listened without interrupting. The restoration would be a collaboration, he continued. My work, my methodology, with access to technical resources I don't have on my own. He glanced briefly at Sienna. We're still working out what that looks like exactly. But the attribution is not negotiable, Eleanor said. Not to me. She nodded once. She looked at Sienna. And you? What do you get from this? Sienna was quiet for a moment. In the flat afternoon light filtering through the barn's high window, she looked tired too. A different kind of tired from Derek's. His was physical, accumulated. Hers was something more internal, the fatigue of someone in the middle of revising a significant thing about how they'd been operating. Access to the restoration process, Sienna said, technical documentation, and my company's name associated with a project done correctly. She paused. And the opportunity to make something right that I made wrong. Eleanor considered this. The woman in the video made a specific comment about a child. Yes, Sienna said. Did you apologize to the child? A brief pause. Not directly, not yet. That seems like an omission, Eleanor said, without particular judgment, in the tone of someone noting a gap in a document. Sienna looked at Derek. Derek said, I'll handle that. Good, Eleanor said, and let it go. The afternoon wound down. Reyes packed his materials with the systematic care of a man who has learned that organization is a form of respect for the work. Eleanor accepted a cup of coffee that Derek made badly and drank without complaint, and they sat in the barn for a while with the heat from the portable ceramic unit and the winter light going gray at the windows, talking about Raymond Costello, about his workshop in Toledo, about the particular notebooks he'd kept, about the way he'd approached a problem from the geometry outward instead of from the mechanics inward, which was unusual for his era. He was difficult, Eleanor said, without softening it. He had high expectations, and he didn't manage them well. We had years that weren't good, my mother and I, because of how completely the work took him over. Nobody offered a response to this. The space held it. But he built beautiful things, she said, and they were his. And for a long time it seemed like the world was going to move on without knowing that. She looked at Derek. You paid $2,500, she said. Yes, ma'am. For 10 cars nobody wanted. Yes, ma'am. She shook her head slowly, but the expression on her face was not the shaking head of a person who thinks something is foolish. It was the expression of a person who has just witnessed something that doesn't fit into the normal categories. Your father taught you to look like that? She asked. He started it, Derek said. I finished it mostly on my own. He died before I got good at it. How old were you? 24. She nodded. She looked at the engine on its stand. 24, she said quietly, as if placing the number somewhere. She left at 5, the car back to Lexington, the train home to Dayton. Derek watched the car go down the county road until the trees took it. He stood in the driveway for a moment in the cold. Behind him, Sienna came out of the barn. She's remarkable, Sienna said. Yes. She wasn't. Sienna paused, working out what she was trying to say. She didn't perform grief about her father or pride. She was just accurate about it. That's what honesty looks like when it's been around a while, Derek said. Sienna looked at him sideways. He wasn't sure if it was the comment or the delivery, but something made her almost smile. I need to talk to my board, she said, about what a formal partnership on this would look like. The restoration side specifically. I'm not in a rush, he said. The cars aren't going anywhere. The press is going to break it open soon regardless. The blog post is getting traction. I know, I have 4 days, maybe 5. I can move fast when I need to, she said. I know you can, he said. That's been part of the problem. She looked at him. That was the closest he'd come to directly addressing the auction, the speed of her dismissal, the efficiency of her mistake. He hadn't said it cruelly. It was just accurate. Yes, she said. It has. She got in the Porsche. She sat in it for a moment without starting it, looking at the barn. Then she looked at him through the window. He expected her to say something else. She didn't. She started the car and backed out, and this time he went inside before she'd made it to the road. Caleb was at the kitchen table with Yvonne, doing something with crayons that had spread across most of the surface area. Did the old lady come? Caleb asked. Eleanor, yes. Was she nice? She was honest, which is better. Caleb considered this with the expression he used for ideas that required processing time. Is honest always better than nice? In my experience, Derek said, pulling off his jacket, most of the time. What about when someone says your drawing is bad? Is your drawing bad? Caleb looked at the crayon project on the table. A little bit, he admitted. Then it's better, Derek said. Dinner in 20 minutes. Wash the crayon off your hands. The next 3 days moved at a different speed from the days before them. Not the grinding daily speed of physical restoration work, but the compressed speed of things that have been building toward a moment. Reyes forwarded his preliminary findings to the Heritage Foundation, where they were met with what he described as significant institutional excitement, museum speak for the kind of response that involves people calling each other from their office phones and asking if you've seen the email. Sienna had 2 calls with Derek, one about the structure of a restoration partnership, one about logistics, and both were businesslike and productive in the way of conversations between people who are trying to get something right rather than trying to win something. She talked to her board. There were terms to work through, but the fundamental agreement was there. The collector from Nashville called again, and this time Derek told him, politely and specifically, that the Plymouth was going to the Mopar registry. I can match whatever they're offering, the collector said. It's not about the number, Derek said. Everything is about the number. Not this, Derek said, and ended the call. The German inquiry went unanswered and eventually stopped coming. On day 34, 4 days past the original 30, the story broke properly. Not from a leak this time, but from the Heritage Foundation's own communications office, which issued a carefully worded statement about a significant find in connection with the work of Raymond Costello. The statement named Derek Vaughan as the individual responsible for the discovery and preservation of the find. It named Eleanor Costello as the authentication witness. It did not mention the Callaway County auction. It did not mention the video. It said what was true about the work and let the context fill itself in. It filled itself in within about 4 hours. By evening, the original 1.2 million view video had doubled. By the following morning, Derek's name was attached to stories in automotive publications he'd been reading since he was a teenager. His phone had 47 missed calls. He answered none of them. He was in the barn, working. There was still a brake line on the Charger that needed replacing, and he had a suspension component on the Camaro to finish documenting, and whatever else was about to happen in the world outside the barn, the work inside it was still the same work it had been on day one. Metal and grease and the slow accumulative truth of hands-on machines. He was under the Charger when Caleb came in after school, still in his coat, backpack on one shoulder. "Dad," Caleb said, "my teacher showed us something in class today." Derek slid out from under the car. Caleb was holding his tablet. They let him take it to school for reading, with a news page open. Derek could see the photograph they'd used, which was the Heritage Foundation's official image of the Charger engine, taken by Rhea's photographer, well lit and precise. "Is that our engine?" Caleb asked. "It's Raymond Costello's engine," Derek said. "We found it. There's a difference." Caleb looked at the article for a moment. He wasn't old enough to read the whole thing, but he could read the headline. "It says you found something everyone missed," Caleb said. "That's the short version." Mrs. Garrett said it was remarkable. He said the word carefully, the way 7-year-olds handle vocabulary they've recently acquired. She said it to the whole class. "About my dad." Derek looked at his son. At the backpack sliding off one shoulder and the coat still on and the tablet with the article about the engine and the expression on his face that was trying to look like it wasn't a big deal, but clearly was. "Yeah?" Derek said. "Yeah," Caleb said. Then, with the particular dignity of a 7-year-old trying not to show he's proud, "I said I knew." Derek reached out and squeezed his son's shoulder once, briefly. Caleb ducked away from it the way kids do, accepting the contact while pretending to resist it. "Go change your clothes," Derek said, "and do your homework before dinner." "Is the lady coming back?" Caleb asked. "The one from before." "Probably." "Is she going to say sorry to me?" "You said she might." Derek thought about what Eleanor had said in the barn. That seems like an omission. "I think she might," he said. Caleb considered this. "Okay," he said, and went toward the house. Derek watched him go. The barn was quiet around him. The portable heater ticking, the winter dark coming in at the windows. 10 vehicles in their rows in various states of documentation and disassembly. The story had broken, and the world was catching up, and the next few weeks were going to be loud in ways that would require navigation. But right now it was just the barn, and the work, and the sound of his son's footsteps across the gravel. He picked up his light and slid back under the Charger. The brake line wasn't going to fix itself. The phone calls didn't stop for 11 days. Derek let most of them go to voicemail and returned the ones that mattered in the evenings after Caleb was in bed, sitting at the kitchen table with a notepad and the particular kind of focused quiet that only exists after a 7-year-old has finally stopped asking questions and gone to sleep. The calls that mattered were from Rhea's, from the 2 museums the Heritage Foundation had identified as candidates for the Charger engine, and from Sienna, whose calls had taken on a different quality since the story broke, less careful, more direct, as if the public nature of the situation had removed a layer of professional insulation she'd been operating behind. The calls that didn't matter were from everyone else. Television producers. A documentary filmmaker based in Los Angeles who left a 4-minute voicemail about vision. 3 separate journalists who described themselves as wanting to tell the real story, which Derek understood to mean they wanted the version that centered whatever angle they'd already decided on before calling him. A man from a marketing agency who wanted to discuss brand partnerships. a phrase that Derek had to ask Yvonne to explain to him, and then wished he hadn't. He returned none of those. What he did do, on the 12th day after the story broke, was drive to the elementary school and ask to speak with Mrs. Garrett. She met him in the hallway outside her classroom during a planning period, a compact woman in her late 40s with reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck, and the brisk, competent manner of someone who has spent 20 years managing rooms full of children and has become genuinely good at reading people as a result. "Caleb mentioned you said something to the class," Derek said, "about what was in the news." "I hope that was all right," she said, with the slight caution of someone who has learned to check before assuming. "I thought it was a teachable moment. We talked about observation, about paying attention to things other people overlook." "That's fine," he said. "That's good, actually. I wanted to ask you something else." He paused. "Is he doing all right? Here, I mean, with other kids." She looked at him with the expression of a teacher who appreciates a parent asking the right question. "He's doing well. Before all this, he was a little quiet. The kind of kid who watches things more than he participates. Which isn't a problem, it's just a style." She folded her hands. "Since the story came out, some of the other children have been paying him more attention. He's handling it carefully. He doesn't brag. He says, 'My dad looks at things differently.' And then he moves on." Derek stood in the hallway for a moment. The school smelled the way schools always smell. Industrial cleaner and construction paper and something indeterminate that was just the accumulation of a lot of young people in one building. "He said that?" Derek asked. "That's what he says?" "Several times," Mrs. Garrett said. "I thought you should know." He thanked her and drove back to the garage. He sat in the truck for a minute before going in, looking at the entrance to the barn, thinking about a 7-year-old explaining his father to a classroom of other 7-year-olds with more accuracy than most adults managed. "My dad looks at things differently." He got out of the truck and went to work. The formal partnership agreement with Ashcroft Automotive's restoration division had been signed 4 days earlier. Not a purchase agreement, but a collaboration structure that Derek had spent a week negotiating through a lawyer in Lexington he'd found through a referral from Reyes. The lawyer, a sharp-eyed woman named Patricia Okafor, who specialized in intellectual property and had taken the case at a reduced rate because she found it genuinely interesting, had walked him through every clause with the patience of someone who believes that the people she represents should understand what they're agreeing to. The structure was this. Derek retained ownership of all 10 vehicles until each one was individually resolved, sold, donated, or otherwise transferred through processes he approved. Ashcroft Automotive's restoration division would provide technical resources, specialized tooling, and expertise for the Charger restoration specifically, in exchange for documented co-credit on the restoration record and a licensing arrangement on the methodology documentation. The Heritage Foundation would conduct and publish the full authentication. Eleanor Costello would receive a formal acknowledgement in all public materials, and the engine's attribution would read as a Raymond Costello original in perpetuity. Patricia Okafor had looked at the final version and said, "This is an unusual agreement." "Is it a good one?" Derek had asked. "For your position?" "Yes. It protects what you said you wanted to protect." "Then it's a good one." He'd signed it with the pen Patricia handed him, which was a nicer pen than he owned, and had driven back to Harlan County and gone straight to the barn and spent 4 hours on the Charger's suspension because the agreement was done and the work was not. What the agreement hadn't resolved, what no agreement could resolve, was the question of the exhibition. It had been Sienna's idea, initially. She'd raised it on a call 10 days after the story broke, carefully, with the tone of someone who has thought about something for a while before saying it out loud. "There's an automotive heritage event in Nashville in 8 weeks, she said. "The Southeastern Collectors Symposium. It's been running for 18 years, serious collectors, museum representatives, press. It would be the right venue for a public presentation of what you found." "What kind of presentation?" "The Charger, the Costello engine, the Plymouth build sheet, the documentation, the whole record of what you did and how you did it." "In Nashville," he said. "It's 4 hours from you. I can handle the logistics." "I can handle my own logistics," he said. A beat. "I meant I can cover the cost." He was quiet for a moment. "What does Ashcroft Automotive get from this?" "Association with something that matters," she said. and the opportunity to stand next to it instead of across from it. He thought about it for 2 days. Then he called Reyes, who confirmed that the Heritage Foundation would participate. Reyes himself would present the authentication findings, and called Eleanor Costello, who said she would come if someone arranged a train and didn't make a fuss about it, and then called Sienna and said yes. 8 weeks, he said. I need the Charger engine in a condition that can be displayed, not fully restored, documented in process. I want people to see the work at the stage it's at, not a finished product. That's an unusual exhibition choice, she said. The finished product isn't the story, he said. The process is. She agreed without argument, which was becoming a pattern he'd noticed. That when he gave her a reason, a real one, she didn't push back for the sake of it. She assessed it and agreed or disagreed based on the actual merits. It was a quality he'd come to appreciate without particularly wanting to think about too carefully yet. The 8 weeks were the hardest sustained stretch of work of Derek's life, which was saying something given the previous 30 days. The Charger restoration was not a simple project under any circumstances. A vehicle that had been in field storage for multiple decades had damage in every system. And the particular challenge of working around a historically significant engine meant that every decision had to be documented and defensible. He couldn't just fix things. He had to record why he fixed them the way he did, what the original condition had been, and what approach was consistent with the vehicle's authenticity. Ashcroft's restoration team sent 2 people, a lead restorer named Gil Montoya, who was 63 years old and had forgotten more about American muscle than most people ever learned, and a documentation specialist named Vera Park, who photographed and cataloged every stage of the work with a precision that initially felt intrusive and eventually felt necessary. Derek and Gil spent the first 3 days in a low-key professional standoff, 2 experienced craftsmen in the same space, each with his own methodology, waiting to see if the other one knew what he was doing. By day 4, they'd worked out a rhythm. Gil deferred to Derek on structure and overall approach. Derek deferred to Gil on certain metallurgical questions that were outside his direct experience. Vera moved around them both and documented everything and occasionally corrected them when they'd moved something without recording its pre-movement condition, which both men found irritating and correct. Caleb, who came to the barn after school most days and had taken to sitting on a stool in the corner doing homework while the adults worked, had decided that Gil was his favorite person in the process. He talks to me like I'm not a kid, Caleb explained to Derek one evening. How does he talk to you? Like I might know things. Derek thought about Gil Montoya, who had grown up in East Los Angeles and started working on cars at 12, and had never gone to a 4-year college and had reached the top of his field through the specific combination of talent and persistence that doesn't fit neatly into most institutions' idea of excellence. Yeah, Derek said. He might. Sienna came twice during the 8 weeks. The first time was a working visit. She came with questions about the logistics of the exhibition and stayed for 6 hours, ending up in the barn watching Gil and Derek work on the Charger's front subframe with the absorption of someone seeing something they'd missed in their prior understanding of what restoration meant at the craft level. Your restoration division, Derek said at one point, not looking up from what he was doing. Do they work like this? Not always, she said honestly. We do good work, but we move faster than this. Speed has a cost. I know that now more specifically than I did before. The second visit was less businesslike. She arrived on a Saturday morning unannounced, which was unusual. She was a person who scheduled things. Derek was alone in the barn, Gil and Vera having gone back to Detroit for the week to handle other commitments. He was working on the Charger's interior documentation, which was painstaking work that required reading the surviving elements of the original build specification against what was physically present. He heard the Porsche on the gravel and came to the barn door. She was carrying 2 coffees and paper cups from the diner on Route 119, which meant she'd stopped there on the way in, which meant she'd been on the county road before she'd called ahead, which meant she'd decided to come and then not told him she was coming. I was in Lexington, she said, handing him one of the cups. Okay, he said. I had a meeting. It ended early. Lexington is 2 hours from here. I know where Lexington is, she said, with a dryness that was becoming familiar. He took the coffee. It was good. She'd remembered he drank it black, which he noted without commenting on. They stood in the barn doorway for a moment in the cold November air, And he didn't ask why she'd really driven 2 hours to drop off coffee, and she didn't explain. And they went inside and he showed her what he'd been working on. She was a good person to show things to. She asked questions that were specific enough to reveal she'd been doing her own reading about period-correct restoration methods, which was not something he'd expected from her. At one point, she picked up a reference photograph he'd pulled from the archive, a factory image of the Charger's original interior configuration, and held it next to the corresponding section of the car and said quietly, "The stitching pattern on the seat bolster. That's hand done." "In the original, yeah. Can you source that today?" "There's one shop in Indiana that does it accurately," he said. "Gil knows them." She set the photograph down. "My father's company," she said, "made the decision to go to machine stitching in 1987. He said no customer would notice." "Did they?" "The ones who cared noticed," she said. "We lost some of them. He thought we'd get them back when we improved the machines. We didn't." She looked at the seat bolster. "I changed it back 4 years ago. Went back to hand stitching on the Heritage trim line. It cost more than the accounting department wanted to spend." "Did you get the customers back?" "Some of them," she said. "Not all. Some of them had decided by then that we weren't the company they'd thought we were, and a stitching pattern wasn't going to change that." He looked at her. She was looking at the car, not at him. "Is that what you're trying to do now?" he asked. "With this?" She thought about the question with a seriousness that suggested she'd been asking it herself. "Partly," she said, "and partly I made a mistake, a public one, that involved you and your son, and the professional mistake underneath it was bigger than I understood at the time." She paused. "I don't like unresolved things." "Neither do I," he said. "Then we have that in common," she said. They drank their coffees and he went back to work and she sat on the stool that Caleb usually occupied and watched. And after a while she started asking questions that were actually useful, and they talked through the interior documentation problem together, and it was ordinary and not ordinary at the same time, in the way of things that are shifting without announcing themselves. Caleb came home at noon from a Saturday morning soccer thing his school had started running, and came directly to the barn still in his cleats, which he was supposed to take off before walking on gravel. He stopped when he saw Sienna. She stood up from the stool. They looked at each other for a moment, the 30-year-old billionaire and the 7-year-old, with mutual assessment. "Hi," Caleb said. "Hi," she said. "I'm Sienna." "I know who you are," Caleb said. "I know you do," she said. "I'm sorry about what I said at the auction, about your dad, and about you." Caleb considered this. He had the Vaughn quality of not rushing a response when he was actually thinking about something. "Dad said you were going to do the sorry part," he said. "Not just say it." "Yes," she said. "Are you doing it?" She glanced at Derek, who gave her nothing, the expression of a man who has decided to let a thing play out on its own terms. "I'm trying to," she said to Caleb. Another pause. "Okay," he said, with the particular finality of a 7-year-old who has made a judgment and filed it. Then he looked at his father. "Can I have lunch?" "Take your cleats off first," Derek said. Caleb went outside to take his cleats off, and Sienna looked at Derek with an expression that was part relief and part something else he couldn't quite categorize. "He's going to be something," she said quietly. "He already is," Derek said. The weeks between that Saturday and the Nashville exhibition were the kind of weeks that are hard to describe because they're made of details rather than events. Long days in the barn, phone calls with Reyes about the authentication report, calls with Patricia Okafor about a secondary agreement covering the Plymouth's transfer to the Mopar registry. Gil and Vera came back, and the Charger work entered its final pre-exhibition phase, where the goal was not completion, but a kind of articulate incompletion. The engine displayed on its stand with the documentation of its history visible alongside it, the vehicle itself in the state Derek had chosen to show it. Structurally sound and cleaned to its bare metal where the rust had been treated, interior stripped and documented, everything exposed and honest about what it was and what it had been through. Tuck Barnett, the dealer who'd bid against Derek at the auction on the bundle lots, pulled up to the garage one afternoon in his truck. He got out slowly, the way he did everything, and walked into the barn and stood looking at the Charger for a long time. "You knew," Tuck said. It wasn't accusatory, just an assessment. I suspected, Derek said. There's a difference. How much did you know at the preview? Enough to be interested, not enough to be certain. Tuck nodded slowly. He looked at the engine on its stand. The woman who laughed at you, he said. She's involved now. She's a partner on the restoration. Tuck was quiet for a moment. He had the face of a man who had watched a lot of things happen in the auction business and had a considered opinion about most of them, but expressed relatively few. You trust that? I trust the agreement, Derek said, and I think she's better than what she showed at the auction. People usually are, Tuck said, without sentimentality. Doesn't mean you trust the better version until you see it operate under pressure. I know, Derek said. Tuck looked around the barn one more time. Good find, he said. Thanks. The engine especially. I know. Tuck nodded and walked back out to his truck and drove away. Derek watched him go and thought about pressure and what it revealed, and about the several weeks he'd just spent watching Sienna Ashcroft make decisions under conditions that were, in their own way, a kind of pressure test. The pressure of having been publicly wrong, and having to figure out what to do in the direction of right without the cover of anonymity or the simplicity of just writing a check and walking away. She'd done it imperfectly. There had been conversations where her instinct to manage a situation had gotten ahead of her, where he'd had to push back, where the old pattern of efficiency over depth had reasserted itself before she'd caught it. But she'd caught it. That was the thing. She'd noticed when she was doing it, and she'd stopped, and that was not nothing. The Nashville exhibition was on a Friday and Saturday in late January. Derek drove down Thursday afternoon with the Charger engine loaded carefully on a padded transport frame in the bed of his truck, with Vera Park following in a rented van with the documentation materials and the Plymouth's build sheet in an archival case. Gil had gone ahead the day before to supervise the exhibition space setup. Caleb was with Yvonne for the weekend. He'd accepted this with only moderate protest, mollified by the promise of a detailed account of everything that happened and a specific request he'd made of Derek that Derek had written down and put in his shirt pocket. The symposium was held at a convention facility in downtown Nashville, a proper venue with high ceilings and professional lighting and the particular smell of an event space that does this kind of thing regularly. When Derek arrived and found the space that had been allocated for the Costello exhibit, he stood in it for a moment and looked at what Gil and Vera had built. They'd done it right. The engine was centered, lit from above with a directional light that caught the machine surfaces the way a workbench light caught them, not glamorously, but honestly. Around it, the documentation, enlargements of Derek's original photographs from the preview and the first days of work, Reyes's authentication materials in archival frames, a timeline of Raymond Costello's career that Eleanor had helped compile, a section of the barn work table reconstructed with the actual tools Derek had used in the early assessment. Not a museum presentation with velvet ropes and institutional distance. A working record, a story told in evidence. On a standalone panel at the entrance to the exhibit space, in clean block text, it read, Engine Number 7. Raymond Costello, engineer. Designed and hand-built circa 1969 to 1971. Discovered in a field-stored 1969 Dodge Charger at the Callaway County Salvage Auction, Harlan County, Kentucky, by Derek Vaughn. Restoration Mechanic. Authenticated by the American Automotive Heritage Foundation, 2024. Authentication witness, Eleanor Costello. Below that, in smaller text, Restoration in progress. Vaughn Restoration, Harlan County, Kentucky, in partnership with Ashcroft Automotive Heritage Division. He read it twice. Then he went to find Vera and start setting up. Sienna arrived that evening with 2 people from her team, not the associates from the auction, different people, with the look of individuals who had been selected for competence rather than presence. She walked through the exhibit space after the setup was complete and stood for a long time in front of the engine. It looks right, she said. Gil did good work on the display. I mean all of it. She turned to look at him. The way it's presented, it doesn't feel like a sales event. It's not. Most automotive exhibitions feel like sales events. I know, he said. That's why it doesn't. She smiled. A real one. Not the polished version, the kind that happens when something catches you off guard in a good way. He'd seen it a few times now. It was a better smile than the public one. Are you nervous? She asked. About tomorrow? No. The press preview is at 9. There are going to be journalists. I know. You're going to have to talk to people. I talk to people. You avoid journalists specifically. Journalists want a story they already have, he said. Tomorrow they'll see the work. If the work is good, the story takes care of itself. If it's not, nothing I say to a journalist makes it better. She looked at him for a moment. I've given hundreds of press events, she said. I've never thought about it that way. You're in the business of managing perception, he said. I'm in the business of doing the work. Different starting points. She was quiet for a moment. Then, I'm giving a statement tomorrow. On behalf of Ashcroft Automotive. I've been working on what to say. Okay. I want to say something about the auction, about what I said. He looked at her steadily. That's your call to make. I know. She paused. I'm going to say I was wrong. Specifically, not a corporate apology. Not, I regret if anyone was offended. I'm going to say I made a fast judgment about a man based on appearance and circumstance, and I said it publicly, and I was wrong. He waited. I wanted you to know beforehand, she said, because it involves you. It does involve me, he said. Does it bother you that I'm going to say it publicly? He thought about it honestly, the way she'd come to expect him to think about things. No, he said. It's true. True things said publicly are better than true things kept quiet. Even when they're embarrassing. Especially then, he said. She nodded. She turned back to look at the engine one more time, and he stood beside her, and they looked at Raymond Costello's 7th engine together in the quiet of the exhibition space before the morning and whatever the morning was going to bring. My father never apologized for anything publicly, she said after a while. Did he do it privately? Occasionally, not easily. Is that where you learned not to? She considered that. Probably. She paused. He was a good man in a lot of ways. He built something real. He just had gaps, places where his instincts failed him. Most people do, Derek said. You seem like someone who has fewer of them than most. He laughed, a short, dry sound. I spent $2,500 I couldn't afford on 10 cars nobody wanted, based on a feeling. That turned out to be right. It could have turned out wrong, he said. I'd have been broke and stupid instead of whatever this is. This, she said carefully, is something. He didn't respond to that. He looked at the engine under its display light, at the machine surfaces that caught the light differently from everything around them, and he thought about his father saying, a well-machined thing has its own light. The exhibition opened the next morning at 9. Reyes presented the authentication findings to a room of 140 collectors, museum professionals, and journalists with the precision and authority of a man who has spent 30 years learning how to communicate the significance of things to people who may not already understand why they're significant. Eleanor Costello sat in the front row and did not speak during the presentation, but answered 3 questions afterward with the dry, precise delivery that was apparently simply how she operated, and the room responded to it the way rooms respond to people who clearly know what they're talking about. Derek spoke briefly, shorter than anyone expected, longer than he'd planned. He talked about the preview, about the shadow in the engine bay, about his father's shop in Pineville. He didn't make a narrative of it. He described it the way it had happened, which was slowly and incrementally and with a lot of uncertainty. People seemed to find that more interesting than a dramatic account would have been, which was something he hadn't anticipated. Sienna spoke last. She stood at the front of the room in a dark jacket, without notes, and she said what she'd told Derek she was going to say, that she had stood in front of a crowd at an auction and laughed at a man's expense and made a specific comment about his child, that she had been fast where she should have been careful and wrong, where she had assumed she was right, that she had no excuse for it and she was not offering one, and that the work in the room behind her, the engine, the documentation, the record of what Derek Vaughn had found and preserved, was the correction to the error, not the apology, because apologies without correction were just words, and she'd spent enough time in business to know the difference. The room was very quiet when she finished. Derek, standing to the side near the exhibit space entrance, looked at the back of her head and thought that she was right. The work was the correction, not the apology. He'd known that from the beginning. He'd just waited to see if she'd figure it out. She had. The press response that came out over the following 48 hours was, as Yvonne reported to him via text from Harlan County, significant. The stories were about the engine and Costello and the authentication, primarily, as they should have been. But they also carried the secondary thread, the auction, the video, the 30 days of work, and now this. The narrative that the internet had written in the first 24 hours had been rewritten by the work itself, the way Derek had said it would be. He didn't read most of the coverage. He read Eleanor Costello's response when Reyes sent it to him. She had issued a single written statement through the Heritage Foundation, thanking the people involved and stating that her father would have been pleased to have his work understood in the context of his actual intentions rather than its incidental location. It was 6 sentences long and said more than most 1,000-word pieces. He saved it to his phone. On Saturday evening, after the exhibition closed and the formal event was done, a small group ended up at a table in the hotel restaurant. Derek, Sienna, Reyes, Gil, Vera, and Eleanor Costello, who was staying the night before her train home Sunday morning. They ate without agenda. Gil and Eleanor discovered a shared opinion about a specific era of American automotive manufacturing and argued it pleasurably for 40 minutes. Reyes talked about a project his institution was considering in the Pacific Northwest. Vera showed Caleb's stool photograph. She'd taken it during one of the barn sessions, Caleb on the stool with his homework, the Charger Hulk behind him, to Sienna, who looked at it for a long moment without saying anything. Derek watched the table, the people at it, what they'd each brought, what the last few months had been made of. The tiredness he'd been carrying since October had settled into something different, not gone, but changed in quality. Less the tired of sustained effort and more the tired of a thing substantially done. Not finished. The Charger was still in process. The Camaro situation was still open. The restoration business had inquiries he hadn't returned yet. There was plenty left. But the weight of the previous weeks had shifted, and he noticed it in his body more than his mind. In the way he was sitting in the chair without the forward lean that had characterized most of the past 3 months. Sienna, across the table, was listening to Gil make a point about carburetor geometry with the genuine interest of someone who had decided to understand something rather than manage her understanding of it. She caught Derek's eye across the table. She didn't say anything. Neither did he. But something passed between them that was real, and they both knew it, and neither of them was in a hurry to put words on it, which was, he was beginning to understand, exactly the right speed for anything that actually mattered. He reached into his shirt pocket and found the folded piece of paper Caleb had given him before he'd left for Nashville. He unfolded it under the table. It said in the careful block printing of a 7-year-old who took handwriting seriously, "Bring me something from Nashville, not food, something real." He folded it back up. He'd found something real. He'd found several things. The question now was figuring out which ones were his to keep. He drove back to Harlan County on Sunday morning alone. Sienna had a flight from Nashville to Detroit. Reyes had a flight to Dearborn. Gil and Vera were driving the documentation van back. Eleanor Costello had her train. Everyone had a direction to return to, and Derek had his, which was the same direction he'd had since before any of this started. North on 65, then east into the hills, the road getting narrower and more specific the closer it got to home. He stopped at a gas station outside of Bowling Green and bought coffee from a machine that tasted like it had been in the machine since the previous administration, and stood beside his truck in the January cold drinking it anyway because he needed the caffeine more than he needed it to taste good. The morning was gray and flat, the kind of winter sky that sits low and doesn't move. He thought about the exhibition, about the room of people who had listened to Reyes present the authentication findings with the absorbed attention of individuals who understood what they were hearing. About Eleanor in the front row, not performing anything, just present. About Sienna at the front of the room saying the things she'd said without notes or hedging, and the silence that followed it. He thought about Caleb's note in his shirt pocket. Something real. He'd bought nothing from Nashville. No souvenir, no item. He'd been in a hotel and an exhibition space and a restaurant, and he'd come back with the same things he'd arrived with, plus the particular weight of having seen something through to a point where it could stand without him holding it up. That would have to be the real thing. He finished the coffee and got back in the truck. The drive through the hills was the part he'd always liked best about living where he lived. The way the land got complicated, the way the road had to work to get anywhere. Flat land made him vaguely uneasy in a way he'd never tried to explain to anyone because it would sound strange. He needed the hills. He needed the road to earn its way. He was 40 minutes from home when his phone rang through the truck's speaker. Patricia Okafor. "I heard the exhibition went well," she said. "Who told you?" "I have Google alerts set for my clients," she said. "Standard practice. Also, Reyes's office sent a press summary." A pause. "There are 3 new inquiries I need to walk you through. 2 are about the Camaro specifically. One from a museum in Chicago, one from a private collector in Connecticut. The third is something different." "What's the third?" "A production company in Los Angeles. They want to make a documentary about the Callaway find. They're specifically interested in you as the central subject." He drove for a moment without speaking. "Derek," Patricia said, "I heard you. The terms they're proposing are, tell them no," he said. A brief pause. "You don't want to hear the terms?" "I don't need to hear the terms. The answer is no." "Can I ask why?" "Documentaries can be significant for establishing reputation in your field." "My reputation in my field is built by the work," he said. "Same as it always has been. I don't need a camera crew in my barn for 6 months to establish it." Patricia was quiet for a moment in the way of a lawyer who disagrees with a client's decision but recognizes it as their decision to make. "Understood," she said. "I'll decline." "Tell them it's not the right time," he said. "Not no forever, just not now." "That's different from what you just said." "I know," he said. "I'm revising." "All right." He could hear her writing something. "The Chicago Museum for the Camaro. Their curator is named James Whitfield. He's legitimate, I've checked. They have the display infrastructure for something like this, and their attribution standards are consistent with what you established with the Heritage Foundation." "Set up a call for next week," he said. "Done." "Connecticut collector wants to make an offer on the Camaro as a private acquisition." "Tell him the Camaro is going to a museum," Derek said, "and that I'll be happy to talk to him about 2 of the other vehicles when I'm ready to move them." "Which 2? "I haven't decided yet. I'll call you." He hung up and drove the rest of the way in silence. Yvonne's car was in the driveway when he pulled in. He could see the kitchen light on through the window. He sat in the truck for a moment, just sitting, the engine ticking as it cooled. The barn was dark. The November through January version of his life was contained in that barn. The 30 days, the authentication, the partnership negotiations, the exhibition prep. All of it had happened in a radius of about 40 feet from where he was parked right now. He got out of the truck and went inside. Caleb was at the kitchen table eating cereal, which appeared to be his default response to most situations. Yvonne was on the couch with her phone, in the particular posture of someone who has been watching a child for 24 hours and is conserving the remaining energy for the drive home. "He was good," Yvonne said, with the tone of a report. "I'm always good," Caleb said. "You were moderately good," Yvonne said, and got up and got her jacket and left, in the efficient way she had of departing once her job was done. Derek sat down across from Caleb at the kitchen table. "How was it?" Caleb asked. "Good." "Did people come?" "A lot of people." Caleb ate a spoonful of cereal and looked at his father with the assessing eyes that Derek had come to recognize as the precursor to a specific kind of question, the kind that was going to be more direct than most adults would think to ask. "Did the engine lady come?" Caleb asked. He'd decided to call Eleanor the engine lady, after Derek had described her as the daughter of the man who built the engine, and Derek had not corrected this because it was accurate. Yes, she sat in the front row. Was she glad? He thought about Eleanor's face during Reyes's presentation, the absolute stillness of it, the way she'd sat without moving for 40 minutes while her father's life work was laid out in documentation and photographs and the testimony of people who understood what it meant. "I think so," he said. "It's hard to tell with her. She doesn't show things easily." "Like you," Caleb said. Derek looked at his son. "You don't show things easily either," Caleb said, without judgment, just observation. "Yvonne says so." "When did you and Yvonne start talking about me?" "She said it when I was brushing my teeth last night. She wasn't saying anything bad." "I know." She said you keep things inside until they're finished, Caleb said. He ate another spoonful. Is the car thing finished? Derek looked at the table, at the cereal box with its faded cartoon mascot, at the homework folder Caleb had left at the corner of the table, slightly bent from being in a backpack, at the kitchen of his rented house in Harlan County, with its cracked linoleum and the window above the sink that looked out onto the gravel driveway. Parts of it, he said. What parts aren't? The Charger still needs work. The Camaro situation needs to be resolved. The restoration business has inquiries I need to sort through. He paused. And some personal things. Caleb looked at him with the gravity that 7-year-olds apply to adult statements they've identified as significant. Is one of the personal things the lady? Derek was quiet for a moment. You can just say yes, Caleb said helpfully. I'm not going to make it weird. You're 7, Derek said. I know, Caleb said, but I'm smart for 7. Derek looked at his son and thought that this was one of those moments he'd probably remember for a long time. Not because anything dramatic happened in it, but because it was true in the way that small domestic moments can be true. Stripped of pretense, just a man and his kid at a kitchen table on a Sunday morning. Yeah, Derek said. One of the personal things is the lady. Caleb nodded, satisfied, and finished his cereal. The weeks that followed Nashville were different in texture from everything before them. The sustained emergency quality of the previous months, the 30 days, the authentication, the partnership negotiations, the exhibition preparation, had resolved into something more like regular life operating at a higher level of complexity than it had before. There were more calls, more decisions, more things requiring attention, but they were the kind of attention that fit into a day rather than consuming it entirely. The Camaro went to the Chicago Museum. The call with James Whitfield was direct and professional, and the transfer was handled through Patricia in a way that established what Derek was coming to think of as his standard: public attribution, documentation of provenance, the work presented in context rather than in isolation. Whitfield sent a photograph of the installed display 2 weeks after the transfer, and Derek looked at it for a long time before sending it to Reyes and then to Eleanor Costello because he thought she'd want to see what properly displayed automotive history looked like. She responded with 4 words. Your father would approve. He'd shown her a photograph of his father's shop during one of their calls, and she'd apparently filed it and connected it to this moment, and the response was so precisely calibrated to what mattered that he kept it the way he'd kept her earlier statement, saved to his phone, in a folder where he put things he wanted to have access to when he needed reminding of something. The restoration business inquiries were more complicated than the collection questions. 6 people had reached out wanting restoration work specifically because of what had been demonstrated at Nashville, not because their vehicles were historically significant in the Costello sense, but because they'd seen what careful work looked like and wanted it. 4 of them were legitimate. Derek could tell the difference between someone who wanted quality work and someone who wanted the brand of quality without the patience it required. He took 2 of the 4, declined 1 outright, and told the remaining one he'd have capacity in 3 months. He hired a part-time assistant, a 19-year-old named Marcus Tilley from Pineville, who had been doing work at a chain shop on Route 119 and who had, in Derek's assessment, the most important quality a young mechanic could have, which was the ability to stay quiet and pay attention when someone more experienced was working. Marcus did not confuse watching with wasting time. Derek had made that mistake himself at 20, and it had cost him 2 years of learning things slowly that he could have learned quickly if he'd been willing to shut up and observe. He told Marcus on his first day, I don't need you to work fast. I need you to work right. Fast comes after right, never before it. Marcus had nodded with the seriousness of someone who was writing it down in his head. And if you don't understand something, you ask, Derek said. Not because asking is humble or whatever, because if you don't ask, you'll guess. And guessing on a vehicle is how you create problems that weren't there when you started. Yes, sir, Marcus said. Don't sir me. I'm 32. Yes, Derek. Better. Gil Montoya called from Detroit in February to say that Ashcroft's restoration division had completed the preliminary specification for the Charger restoration. The full plan, phase by phase, with material sourcing and methodology documentation that would accompany the work at every stage. He described it in terms that were technical and specific, and Derek listened to all of it before asking one question. "What's your read on the engine?" he said. "When it's done, when Costello's 7th actually runs." Gil was quiet for a moment. "It'll be something," he said, which from Gil was a superlative. "The design it's better than the era it came from. There's a reason he called it the one that came out right. You'll hear it when it runs." "When do you think? Realistically?" 8 months, maybe 10, if we don't hit surprises." "There are always surprises." "Okay," Derek said. "You'll be there when it runs," Gil said. It wasn't a question. "I'll be there, Derek said. Sienna called on a Tuesday evening in February, later than her usual calls, but past 9, which meant she'd been in meetings most of the day, and this was the window she'd found. He was at the kitchen table with paperwork, Marcus's hours and the parts orders for the 2 new commissions, and he answered on the second ring. "I have something to tell you," she said without preamble, which was increasingly how she opened conversations with him. No small talk runway, just the thing she was calling about. He'd come to appreciate it. "Okay. My board approved a new program, a restoration training initiative, 6-month intensive, working directly alongside experienced restorers on documented projects. We take 6 candidates per cycle, young mechanics, people who can't access traditional training pathways." He set down his pen. "When did this happen?" "Vote was this morning. I've been working on it for 2 months. You didn't mention it." "I wanted to know if it would pass first," she said. "I didn't want to talk about a thing that wasn't going to exist." He thought about that, about the particular discipline of not naming something until it was real. It was the way he operated, had always operated, which was why he hadn't told anyone what he'd suspected about the Charger engine until he was certain enough that the certainty was defensible. He hadn't expected to find that quality in her. "The program needs a partner site," she said. "A working restoration shop, not a manufacturer's facility. Somewhere the candidates are doing actual client work, not training projects." He was quiet for a moment. "I'm not asking you tonight," she said. "I'm telling you it exists and that I'd like you to think about whether your shop is the right location for the first cycle. Take whatever time you need." "You'd be bringing 6 people into my barn," he said. "3 at a time," she said. "We split the cycle into 2 cohorts, and we cover all operational costs. You provide the mentorship and the methodology." "And my name on the program?" "Your name and your method. That's the whole point." He looked around his kitchen. At the cracked linoleum and the Texas-shaped water stain, he could see on the ceiling of the next room from where he was sitting. At the homework folder still at the corner of the table, though it was Caleb's second homework folder because the first one had finally collapsed under the weight of a school year. "I need to think about the space," he said. "I'd need to expand. The barn can't hold what I'm running now, plus 6 additional people at any capacity." "I know," she said. "I'd like to help with that." "The expansion?" "Yes." "That's a significant thing," he said. "I know it is." He was quiet for a moment, thinking about what significant meant in this context. Not just the money, though it was the money, practically, but what it represented in the structure of things. Ashcroft Automotive's name on the building that housed Vaughn Restoration. The billionaire's investment in the mechanic's shop. He thought about how that story read from the outside. And then he thought about whether the outside reading was the right frame to use, and decided it probably wasn't. "Can I ask you something?" he said. "Yes?" "Why this? You have a training program already at your facility. You have the infrastructure." "Because my facility trains people to work for Ashcroft Automotive," she said. "This would train people to do what you do. Work independently with the kind of knowledge and patience that doesn't fit inside a production timeline. Those are different things." "And you want that to exist?" "I think it should exist," she said. "I think there are young mechanics who are the way you were, who have the capacity for this kind of work, and who don't have access to it because there's nowhere to learn it. And I think it would be a waste if that continued." He sat with that for a moment. The flat directness of it, the way she'd said it without rhetorical architecture, just the thing she believed. "Give me 2 weeks," he said. "You have them," she said. He thought about it for 1 week, not 2, and then called Patricia Okafor and asked her to start drafting the framework for a partnership agreement that covered the training program and the facility expansion separately, with distinct terms for each. Patricia said, "This is becoming a complex relationship. in the neutral tone of a lawyer who is noting a fact without editorializing on it. I know, Derek said. Complex isn't bad, Patricia said. It just requires precision. That's usually my preference, he said. He told Sienna yes on a Thursday morning, and she said good, and they spent the next 45 minutes talking through practical specifics with the efficiency of two people who had, over the previous several months, developed a working shorthand. When he hung up, he sat at the kitchen table for a moment. He called Caleb's school and left a message for Mrs. Garrett, asking if the class might be interested in a visit to a working restoration shop sometime in the spring. Not a field trip with a bus and permission slips and chaperones, just a visit, if she could arrange it, so that 20-some kids could see what it looked like when someone was in the middle of making something that had been broken work again. Mrs. Garrett called back inside an hour and said yes, emphatically. Spring arrived in Harlan County the way it always did. Gradually and then suddenly, the hills going from bare to improbably green in what seemed like a matter of days. The expansion of the garage was underway by April. Earl Compton, who Derek had expected to be difficult about modifications to his property, had instead been quietly pleased in the way of old men who have held on to something long enough to see it become worth more than it was. He'd told Derek he could do what he needed, and they'd settle the lease terms after. "You've been a good tenant," Earl said, which was the most he'd ever said about anything personal. "You've been a good landlord," Derek said, which was mostly true. The construction crew, 3 guys from Pineville who came, recommended by somebody who came recommended by somebody, worked for 6 weeks and left Derek with a space that was twice what he'd had, with proper ventilation and lighting and a dedicated documentation area that Vera Park had specified remotely, and that Derek had modified twice because the original spec didn't account for the way he actually worked, and then modified once more because the second version still wasn't quite right. Marcus Tilley, watching the third modification happen, said, "How do you know when it's right?" "When it stops needing to be changed," Derek said. Marcus thought about this. "That could take forever." "Most things worth doing could take forever," Derek said. "You do them anyway, and you stay honest about what's not finished." Marcus nodded slowly, with the expression of someone adding something to a mental list. The first cohort of the training program, they'd named it simply the Vaughn Restoration Fellowship, which Sienna had suggested, and Derek had accepted without the false modesty of pretending he didn't think it was right, arrived in June. 3 candidates, selected from 87 applications that had come in after a quiet announcement that Sienna had placed through her company's communication channels, and that had spread from there in the way things spread when they address something people have been waiting for. The 3 who came were a 23-year-old woman from Mississippi named Dara Hobbs, who had been doing her own restoration work in her family's driveway for 4 years, and whose portfolio photographs showed a level of technical accuracy that made Gil, who reviewed them, say, "Where has this person been?" A 26-year-old from rural Ohio named Preston Ware, who had an automotive technology certificate and 3 years at a dealership service department, and who had written in his application, without drama, that he wanted to learn the kind of work that couldn't be done on a clock. And a 30-year-old from East Tennessee named Claudette Marsh, who had been a diesel mechanic for 7 years and who had started restoring a 1965 Mustang in her spare time and had gotten 2/3 of the way through before realizing she needed to learn things she didn't know. Derek met them on this first morning in the expanded garage before anything else happened and said the same things he'd said to Marcus, about fast and right, about asking instead of guessing, and then added, "Every vehicle that comes through here has a history. Some of it's documented. Some of it you have to read from the metal itself. Your job is to learn how to read it. That takes time, and it takes humility, and if you have a problem with either of those things, now is the time to say so." None of them had a problem with either of those things, or if they did, they kept it appropriately to themselves for the moment. Dara was the one who asked the question he'd been waiting for someone to ask on that first day. "The Charger," she said. "The Costello engine. Are we going to work on that?" "No," Derek said. "That's a separate project with a separate team. Will we see it?" "When it runs," he said. "Yes." She nodded, satisfied, and went to look at the vehicle that was currently on the lift, a 1970 Plymouth Roadrunner with a documented racing history that Derek had acquired 2 months earlier and that was, in his assessment, a solid teaching vehicle because it was complicated without being irreplaceable. Caleb came by after school the way he always did, And on the first day of the fellowship, he stood in the doorway of the expanded garage and looked at the three new people working alongside his father and Marcus. And then he looked at Derek with a question in his face. "Good?" he asked. "Good," Derek said. Caleb nodded and went to his stool. His stool had migrated to the new space in the expansion, placed in the corner nearest the documentation table because that was where Derek most often worked when he was at a desk rather than under a car, and opened his homework. Sienna came in June, the week after the fellowship started. She'd been in Nashville for a board meeting, she said, and had driven up. He was beginning to understand that Sienna's relationship with the distance between Nashville and Harlan County had fundamentally changed since the previous October, and that the changes had very little to do with automotive heritage or business logistics. She arrived on a Saturday when the fellows were off, and Marcus wasn't in, and Derek was working alone on the Roadrunner's front suspension, the familiar work of his hands and the radio on the shelf his father had kept a radio on too, the same habit inherited without decision. She sat on the stool that was usually Caleb's. "The fellowship applications for the second cycle are already coming in," she said. "We haven't even announced a second cycle officially." "Word travels," he said. "The quality is extraordinary. Reyes wants to host one of the fellows for a 3-month rotation at the Heritage Foundation in the second year. He called me last week." "I heard. He called me too." "And?" "And I think it's a good idea," Derek said. "Understanding authentication makes you a better restorer. Knowing what makes something historically significant changes how you approach the work." She was quiet for a moment. He came out from under the car and stood up, and she was looking at the expanded space, the documentation wall, the proper lighting, the way the equipment was arranged, with the expression of someone looking at a thing they helped make and trying to reconcile the fact of it with what it used to be. "This is real now," she said. "It was real before," he said. "I mean, it's bigger than I thought it would be when I first came here." He wiped his hands on the shop rag. "What did you think it would be?" "I thought I was coming to make an offer on a collection." She paused. "I thought it was a business situation I'd mishandled and could correct with the right terms. And instead, she said, it was a whole thing." He looked at her. She was sitting on a 7-year-old stool in a garage in Harlan County, Kentucky, in clothes that were practical and slightly oil-stained from the last time she'd been here, and had apparently not noticed or not minded, and she was being honest with him in the direct, unarchitectured way she'd learned to be honest with him over the course of months that had changed more than either of them had planned on. "Sienna," he said. "Yes." "I need to tell you something." She looked at him with the steadiness of someone who has gotten better at waiting. "I don't do things fast," he said. "You know that. It's not a personal quality I'm working on. It's just how I'm built. Things take as long as they take, and I don't rush them." "I know," she said. "That includes this," he said. "Whatever this is." "I know that too," she said. "I'm not rushing you." "I know you're not." He set down the shop rag. "I'm telling you because I want you to know that slow is not the same as uncertain. It's just slow." She looked at him for a long moment. The afternoon light came through the high windows of the expanded garage and landed on the Roadrunner's hood and on the documentation wall with its photographs and on her face, which was open in a way that was still, even after all these months, slightly unexpected on her. The version of her face that existed when she wasn't managing anything. "Okay," she said, simply, without transaction. "Okay," he said. He went back to the suspension, and she stayed on the stool, and after a while she picked up one of the reference manuals from the documentation table and started reading it, and they were in the same space in a way that was easy and real and didn't require either of them to perform anything. That was, he'd come to understand, what he'd been looking for without knowing he was looking for it. In October, 1 year after the Callaway County auction, the Charger engine ran for the first time since Raymond Costello had last heard it. Gil had called 3 weeks earlier to say they were close, and Derek had driven to Detroit with Caleb, who had been told where they were going and had treated the information with the solemnity of an event that warranted real shoes instead of sneakers, which was his personal measure of significance. The session was at Ashcroft's restoration facility, a proper shop with the equipment and controlled conditions that a test run of a 50-year-old hand-built engine required. Reyes was there. Vera had flown in to document it, Sienna was there, standing near the back with her arms at her sides rather than crossed, the body language of someone who is not managing a situation but simply present in it. Eleanor Costello was there. She'd taken the train from Dayton, as always, and she'd come into the facility with the same upright deliberateness she'd brought into Derek's barn 11 months earlier, and she'd found a chair and sat in it, and she hadn't said much to anyone. The charger, still in process, as Derek had said it should be, not finished, honest about what it was, sat on the shop floor with the engine reinstalled and the instrumentation connected. Gil went through the pre-start checklist with the methodical patience of someone who knows that what comes before the moment is what determines whether the moment goes right. Caleb stood next to Derek with his hands in his jacket pockets, watching everything. "Is it going to be loud?" Caleb asked quietly. "Probably," Derek said. "Good," Caleb said. When Gil said they were ready, the shop got quiet. The way spaces get quiet when everyone in them is waiting for the same thing at the same time. That particular silence that's made of held breath and attention. The engine started. Not dramatically, not cinematically. It caught on the third crank with the specific voice of a thing that has been designed to work and is now, after a very long time, working. The sound it made was not the sound of a stock engine. It was something in between, smoother in some registers, rougher in others. The acoustic signature of a machine built by hand to principles that were ahead of its era. Gil had said you'll hear it when it runs, and he was right. There was something in the sound that was different from the other engines Derek had started in 30 years of doing this work. He didn't try to name what it was. He just listened. He looked at Eleanor Costello. She was sitting straight in her chair with her hands folded in her lap, and her face was doing the thing he'd noticed before, showing nothing that was easy to name. But her eyes were bright with something, and she wasn't blinking, and that was enough. Gil brought the revs up carefully, through the ranges, listening for anything that needed adjustment. The instrumentation read correctly. The oil pressure held. The temperature came up and stabilized. Everything Raymond Costello had designed was doing what Raymond Costello had designed it to do 53 years later, in a facility in Detroit, in front of his daughter and the mechanic who had found it in a field-stored car that nobody else had thought was worth looking at. After 15 minutes, Gil brought it back to idle and looked at Derek. Derek looked at Eleanor. She stood up from her chair, slowly, taking her time, and walked to the car and stood next to it while the engine ran at idle. She didn't touch anything. She just stood next to it and listened. None of them spoke. After a moment, she reached into her coat and brought out something small. A folded piece of paper, old and soft with age. The kind of fold that happens when something has been carried for a very long time. She held it in both hands but didn't open it. He wrote down what he wanted it to sound like, she said, to no one in particular or to everyone. When he was designing the 7th one, he wrote it in his notebook. He said, she paused. He said it should sound like it means to be here. The engine ran at idle. No one said anything for a moment. "Does it?" Caleb asked. He'd asked it with the directness of a child who doesn't have the adult instinct to wait for the appropriate moment, and the question landed in the room without apology, the way true questions do. Eleanor looked at him. Then she looked at the engine, and she listened. "Yes," she said. "It does." She folded the paper back up and put it in her coat and sat back down in her chair, and Gil let the engine run for another 10 minutes before shutting it down. And the silence that followed was a different quality of silence from the one that had preceded the start. The silence after something, rather than before it. Derek stood there in it. He thought about the auction, about 10 cars that nobody else wanted, about $2,500 that was every dollar he had, about a shadow that fell wrong in an engine compartment at the right angle at the right moment, about a woman who laughed loud enough for a crowd to hear and the same woman reading a restoration manual on a stool in his garage 8 months later, about a 7-year-old asking, "Is it going to be loud?" and the same 7-year-old a year before asking, "How do you know if it's a good car when nobody else thinks so?" About his father's shop in Pineville, the radio on the shelf, the specific quality of light through the high windows, about the fact that the things that mattered had never been the dramatic things. Not the discovery, not the authentication, not the exhibition, not the engine starting. Those were real, and they were good, but they were the surface of something whose substance was elsewhere, in the accumulation of slower things, the way you hold a flashlight, the angle you crouch at, whether you're willing to stay in a cold barn longer than the next person, whether you ask questions when you don't know something or whether you guess and move on, whether you do the work or you just talk about doing it. Sienna appeared beside him, not dramatically, just the quiet presence of someone who has been in the same room and moved to stand in the same place. "Well," she said. "Yeah," he said. They stood there for a moment, not touching, not needing to. "The second fellowship cycle starts in January," she said. "I know. 8 applicants we can't decide between. I'll look at the files this week." "There's one from Kentucky," she said, 17 years old. "She's been restoring a motorcycle in her parents' garage for 2 years. The photographs are—" "Send them to me," he said. She sent them that evening, and he looked at them on his phone in the hotel room that night. Caleb asleep in the other bed with the particular abandoned quality of a child who has had a significant day and fallen directly into unconsciousness. The photographs were of a 1971 Honda motorcycle, being brought back from a condition that most people would have called terminal. The work in the pictures was not perfect. There were things in it that needed correction, but the approach was right. The angle was right. The attention was in the right places. The kid, whoever she was, knew how to look. He sent back 2 words: "Call her." He put his phone on the nightstand and lay in the dark and listened to Caleb breathe. Outside the hotel window, Detroit moved through its night, the low hum of a city that had been built around making things and had survived every version of being told that making things no longer mattered. He'd always had a complicated feeling about Detroit, not complicated in the way of ambivalence, but in the way of things that contain more than one true thing simultaneously. It was a city that understood what he understood, that the work was the point, that what you made with your hands was the record of who you were, and that being overlooked was a condition, not a verdict. He thought about the training program, about the 87 applications that had come in for 3 spots, about the 17-year-old in Kentucky with the photographs, about Marcus Tilley, who had gotten quieter and better simultaneously over the months he'd been at the shop, who had last week identified a cracked frame rail on a client vehicle that Derek had very nearly missed and had done it without announcement, just brought Derek over and pointed and waited. There were more of them. More people who could do this work, who wanted to do it, who just needed a place where slow was the right speed and right was worth the cost of fast. He was going to need a bigger barn. He fell asleep thinking about that and did not dream, and in the morning he and Caleb ate breakfast at a diner near the hotel and talked about whether a 1971 Honda motorcycle was a better first restoration project than a car. And Caleb said he thought vehicles with fewer wheels were probably easier. And Derek said it wasn't about the number of wheels. It was about whether you were willing to learn the thing you didn't already know. And Caleb thought about that for a moment and then said, "Okay, but also fewer wheels is probably easier." And Derek said, "Probably not wrong." And they drove back to Kentucky in the morning light with the hills coming up gradually, and then all at once the way they always did, and the road earning its way home. Some things take time. Some things take longer than that. The ones that are worth it usually take exactly as long as they need to, and the only way to know is to stay in it until you know. Derek Vaughn knew that. He'd always known it. He just finally had a life that showed it from the outside too.